In 753 BCE, on a muddy hillside above a lazy bend in the Tiber River, someone decided to build a village. It had a population you could count in the hundreds. No marble, no aqueducts, no empire. Just a cluster of round huts with thatched roofs, a river that flooded every spring without fail and without apology, and people trying to make the best of a muddy, fever-prone valley in the middle of a peninsula nobody had yet thought to name. Within 12 centuries, that village would rule an empire of 70 million people, stretching from the rain-soaked hills of northern Britain to the sun-bleached sands of Mesopotamia. And here is what I want you to hold in your mind tonight, the question that puzzled historians then and puzzles them now. The people who lived through Rome's final collapse did not know they were living through it. A city of 1 million people, the largest in the ancient world, shrank to 30,000 in less than 2 centuries. And those 30,000 grazed cattle in what had once been the center of civilization. How does a world forget how to be itself? We'll get there, but first, we need to understand how it all began. Before we settle in, if you enjoy what we do here, a like or subscribe genuinely helps us keep making these. And if you have memories, things your parents or grandparents told you about empires rising and falling, about old ways giving ground to new ones, I'd especially love to hear them in the comments below. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 2: The 7 Hills and the Geography That Built an Empire. The story of Rome is, in the beginning, deeply undramatic. And that is precisely what makes it interesting. Imagine standing on any one of 7 hills south of where the Tiber bends westward toward the sea, sometime around 850 BCE. The valley below you is marshy, fever-prone, cut by seasonal streams that swell to muddy torrents each spring and shrink to trickles each summer. The hills around you are covered in oak and hornbeam and scrubby Mediterranean maquis. There are other people on nearly every adjacent hill living in their own clusters of huts, speaking variations of a language that would eventually become Latin, farming small plots, herding goats and sheep, keeping their distance from their neighbors unless trade or war made proximity unavoidable. Nobody was thinking about empire. Nobody was writing anything down yet. So we know this partly from archaeology, and partly because when people are genuinely thinking about empire, they tend to write it down fairly promptly. These were the Latin people, one of several Italic tribal groups who had drifted into the peninsula over the preceding centuries, jostling for space and resources with the Sabines to their northeast, the Etruscans to their north, and a bewildering number of other Italic tribes in every other direction. They were farmers who supplemented agriculture with herding and occasional raiding, which in the ancient world amounted to a fairly standard approach to regional economics. What distinguished the site that would become Rome from the dozens of similar villages scattered across the Tiber Valley was, rather bluntly, real estate. The bend in the Tiber that the Romans eventually called their own happened to be the precise location where the river narrowed and shallowed enough to ford, or at least narrow enough that you could wade across without losing more than half your livestock in the process. This is not a trivial detail. This is everything. Because it meant that any north-south traffic along the length of the Italian peninsula traders moving copper from Etruria, salt from the coast, cattle from the southern highlands, had to pass through this point, and anyone who controlled a river crossing controlled the movement of goods, and anyone who controlled the movement of goods had leverage. And leverage, in the ancient world, translated with remarkable directness into walls and weapons and grain stores. The Romans had the good fortune, or the good sense of sitting astride the most strategically valuable geographic feature for hundreds of miles in any direction. The hills gave them defense. A clutch of people on a defensible hilltop with a palisade can hold off forces many times their size, which is something that armies have understood from the first moment armies existed. The Tiber gave them trade. The nearby coastal salt flats at the river's mouth, the Selinae, gave them something even more precious: salt, which was to the Roman economy what petroleum would become to ours 18 centuries later. Soldiers were paid partly in salt. The word salary descends directly from the Latin salarium, the salt allotment, something to consider the next time your direct deposit lands. But geography alone does not build an empire. Geography creates the preconditions. It provides the stage. What happens on that stage is decided by the people who stand on it, the farmers and merchants and soldiers and mothers and slaves and senators who, generation by generation, turned a muddy riverside village into something the world had never quite seen before and, in certain respects, has never quite seen since. The Etruscans deserve particular attention here, because understanding Rome without understanding the Etruscans is rather like understanding New York without understanding the Dutch. The Etruscans were the dominant civilization of the Italian peninsula from roughly 800 BCE onward, and sophisticated, urbanized, literate, in a script that still isn't fully decoded, accomplished in metalworking and art and agriculture. They occupied the territory immediately north of the Tiber, and for roughly 2 centuries, they were Rome's most immediate and most influential neighbors. Several of Rome's early kings, by Roman tradition, were Etruscan. The temple architecture, the toga, the practice of reading the future from animal entrails all borrowed or adapted from Etruscan precedent. The Romans were attentive students. They watched what the Etruscans built and built versions of it themselves. They watched what the Etruscans traded and inserted themselves into the same trade routes. They adopted Etruscan engineering techniques particularly for drainage, since Rome's valley floor between the hills was, in its natural state, a malarial swamp. The Romans built a massive drainage channel called the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, which emptied into the Tiber and turned the fetid, marshy Forum Valley into usable dry land. It still functions today, which puts it in the company of very few engineering projects from the 7th century BCE that you might consider still operational. This is, in essence, the foundational truth of Rome's rise. Not divine favor, not some mystical national genius, but a willingness to look at what other people were doing well and borrow it without embarrassment. The Romans would spend the next several centuries doing exactly this, absorbing the cultures, technologies, and sometimes the populations of every people they encountered, reshaping what they borrowed into something distinctly their own. It is, depending on your perspective, either the most pragmatic quality a civilization can possess or the most culturally acquisitive. Quite possibly both. We'll return to this question. But first, we need to establish how the city that did all this absorbing actually came into being. And here is where the history gets considerably more entertaining, because here is where we meet the Romans' own account of their origins. And there is one more thing about the 7 hills worth understanding before we go further, something that the geography of Rome made almost inevitable, and that would shape the character of the city for the entirety of its existence. The hills were inhabited by different peoples, the Palatine and Aventine by Latin settlers, the Quirinal and Viminal by Sabines, the Capitoline by communities of uncertain origin. Each hill was its own small world, with its own customs and its own leaders and its own particular attitude toward the hills around it. The genius of early Rome, if we can call the stumbling, violent, frequently accidental process of early Roman development genius, was that it found ways, eventually, to knit these separate communities into a single political unit, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through marriage alliance, and occasionally through the more direct approach of simply absorbing everyone who lived nearby, whether they'd agreed to the arrangement or not. We'll get to the Sabines shortly. Women in these earliest communities carried the weight of domestic economy with a thoroughness that would be recognizable to any woman who kept a household running during the war years. The weaving of fabric, the grinding of grain, the preservation of food, the management of the household's water supply, these were not peripheral activities. They were the operating system without which nothing else functioned. We know from archaeological sites around the Tiber Valley that the women of these early Latin and Sabine communities were accomplished weavers producing fine-quality textiles, skilled potters, and, in at least some communities, active participants in religious ritual. The historical record, typically written by men and for men, tends to undercount them. The archaeological record, which does not share that bias, tells a more complete story. Later in tonight's journey, we'll talk about how the legal and social status of Roman women shifted dramatically over the centuries from the near-total legal subjugation of the early Republic to the remarkable economic independence some women achieved in the imperial period. But that story doesn't quite make sense yet. We need the Republic first, and before the Republic, we need the kings. Chapter 3: 7 Kings and the Stories We Tell About Them. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and also where historians begin to get visibly uncomfortable at dinner parties. The Romans believed their city was founded in 753 BCE by a man named Romulus. They had a very specific date, the 21st of April. They even had an exact time mid-afternoon between the 2nd and 3rd hour, according to the astronomer Marcus Terentius Varro, who worked it out in the 1st century BCE with the rigorous confidence of a man who has absolutely no way of knowing this. Romulus had a twin brother named Remus. Their mother was a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, which, if you're keeping track, represents something of a professional contradiction for a Vestal virgin. Their father was the war god Mars. As infants, the twins were abandoned on the Tiber's banks, the standard precaution when inconvenient royal infants threatened a usurper's ambitions and subsequently suckled by a she-wolf. Then Romulus killed Remus in an argument about which hill to build the city on, which may be the most Roman solution to a disagreement ever recorded. Modern historians are skeptical of essentially all of this. Not the part about a Latin settlement forming on the Palatine Hill. Archaeology firmly supports that. Not even the part about a consolidation of separate hilltop communities into something resembling a unified settlement around the 8th century BCE. That appears to have happened. But the twins, the wolf, the Vestal mother, the precise April date, the divine paternity, these belong to the category of founding myths that every great civilization assembles to give itself a suitably dramatic origin story. The Greeks had Romulus's equivalent in the legends of Theseus and Cadmus. The Hebrews had Abraham. The Etruscans themselves had elaborate accounts of their own divine origins. Rome's founding myth is simply more entertaining than most, with an economy of narrative violence that feels appropriately Roman. What we can say with confidence is that the Romans, in their earliest centuries, lived under kings, 7 of them by their own account, spanning from roughly 753 to 509 BCE. The names are instructive. Romulus was Latin. His successor, Numa Pompilius, was Sabine, the tribe to the northeast. Tullus Hostilius was Latin again. Ancus Martius was half Sabine. Tarquinius Priscus and his eventual successor, Servius Tullius, were Etruscan. And the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was Etruscan again. Even in its royal period, Rome was a city of absorbed neighbors, a city that seems to have had a remarkable talent from its earliest days for taking in outsiders and eventually convincing them they were Roman. The seven kings of Rome, assuming they all existed as distinct historical individuals rather than as conflations of real rulers, legendary figures, and later literary invention, reigned over a city that was growing with remarkable speed. By the late 7th century BCE, Rome was no longer simply a collection of hilltop villages. It was beginning to look like an actual city. The Forum Valley, drained by the Cloaca Maxima, was becoming a genuine civic space. The first recognizable temples were being built, in the Etruscan architectural tradition, with terracotta roof decorations and painted wooden columns. The first defensive wall, the Servian Wall, attributed to the sixth of the seven kings, Servius Tullius, was beginning to take shape, enclosing a territory large enough to contain a population of perhaps 30 to 40,000 people. That is a very different place from the muddy cluster of huts we started with. It was during this period that the Romans received some of their most lasting cultural inheritances from the Etruscans, and not just in architecture. The toga itself, the garment that would become the defining symbol of Roman identity, was Etruscan in origin, a semicircular woolen mantle worn draped over the left shoulder. The practice of holding auguries reading the future from the flight patterns of birds or from the internal organs of sacrificed animals was Etruscan. The fasces, the bundle of rods with an axe that became the Roman symbol of magisterial authority and would, in much later centuries, lend its name to a particularly unpleasant 20th century political movement, was Etruscan. The Romans were borrowing with both hands, and they were doing it from neighbors who had a great deal worth borrowing. Life for ordinary Romans during the period of the kings was, by any modern measure, extraordinarily difficult. But the Romans who lived it would not have recognized the word difficult as a particular criticism. It was simply the texture of existence, and they had no other texture to compare it against. A free Roman male of middling means in, say, the 6th century BCE would have inhabited a world organized around two dominant realities: the family and the farm. The Roman family in this period was organized around a concept called the paterfamilias, the father of the family, who exercised a power over his household that Roman law called patria potestas, or fatherly authority. In its formal extent, this power was nearly absolute. The paterfamilias had legal authority over his wife, his children, his grandchildren, his slaves, and any free persons he had adopted into the household. He could, in theory and sometimes in practice, sell family members into slavery, disown children, arrange or dissolve marriages, and exercise capital punishment over members of his household. We would not find this admirable. The Romans of later centuries became increasingly uncomfortable with its more extreme applications as well. But in the archaic period, it was simply the organizing principle of the world's smallest and most fundamental unit of society. Those who served in military households during the war years, or who grew up under a strict father's authority, as many watching tonight certainly did, will recognize something of the Roman model, though without, one hopes, the more extreme legal provisions. The Roman family was both a biological unit and an economic enterprise and a religious congregation all at once. The household gods, the lares and penates, small clay or bronze figurines kept in a little domestic shrine, were tended daily by the women of the household, particularly by the matron, who was the paterfamilias's wife and the center of the household's domestic economy. Her status, while formally subordinate in law, was in daily practice the kind of authority that anyone who has spent time in a well-run household will immediately recognize. Now, the Sabine women. We should talk about the Sabine women, because the story Romans told about them is perhaps the single most revealing thing about how Romans understood their own early history. The founding of the city posed an immediate practical problem for Romulus in the Roman account of things. His new settlement was composed primarily of men, refugees, runaways, landless young men looking for opportunity, the sort of population that builds cities, historically, but cannot sustain them without rather significant demographic additions. Romulus reportedly requested that neighboring peoples allow their daughters to marry Roman men. The neighboring peoples, particularly the Sabines, declined this invitation, regarding Rome as a rough and dubious settlement unlikely to survive its first generation. Romulus responded by organizing a festival, inviting the neighboring communities to attend, and then, during the games, having his men seize all the unmarried Sabine women present and carry them off as wives. The Romans called this the raptio, the abduction of the Sabine women, and they told the story with a mixture of pride in Roman resourcefulness and a certain uncomfortable acknowledgement that this was not, by any civilized standard, acceptable behavior. Subsequent Roman writers went to considerable lengths to emphasize that the women were not harmed, that Romulus himself married a Sabine woman and treated her with respect, and that the Sabine women eventually chose to remain in Rome, and indeed stepped between the Roman and Sabine armies when the Sabines came to reclaim them, which, the Romans argued, proved they had adjusted to their new circumstances satisfactorily. Modern readers will note that this argument leaves rather a lot to be desired, but it reflects something real about how the Romans thought about their own origins, as a story of absorption, of forced integration that eventually became genuine community, of outsiders becoming Roman. The 7 kings collectively oversaw Rome's transformation from a village to a city, and then the last of them, Tarquinius Superbus, made the fatal error that kings have been making as long as there have been kings. He confused the trappings of power with the consent of the governed. Tarquin the Proud ruled by fear rather than consent. He executed senators without trial. He dismantled the political institutions his predecessors had built. He refused to consult the Senate. His son committed a serious crime against a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia, the wife of a respected Roman aristocrat, a woman known for her virtue and her management of her household even in her husband's absence. She reported the assault to her father and husband and then died by her own hand. The public fury that followed was the spark. A Roman aristocrat named Lucius Junius Brutus, who had survived at court by pretending to be simple-minded, which may say something useful about the intelligence requirements for survival in a tyrant's court, organized the expulsion of the Tarquin family from Rome. Lucretia's story was remembered and retold by the Romans for centuries because it touched something fundamental in Roman values: the virtue of the Roman matron, the obligation of men to protect that virtue, and the absolute intolerability of tyranny that violated both. Her name became, in Roman memory, a kind of shorthand for the entire transition from kingdom to republic. Whether the events occurred exactly as described, whether Lucretia herself was quite the person Roman tradition made of her, is something historians debate with cautious and appropriate humility. The archaeology cannot speak to individual lives, but the fact that the Romans chose to remember the founding of the Republic through a woman's story, through a crisis of personal honor and civic virtue, tells us a great deal about what they thought the Republic was supposed to stand for. In 509 BCE, the Romans expelled Tarquinius Superbus and declared that never again would Rome be ruled by a king. They meant it with an intensity that would shape Roman politics for the next 500 years. The word rex king became practically an obscenity in Roman political vocabulary. Centuries later, when Julius Caesar was suspected of wanting to make himself king, that suspicion played no small role in the events of the Ides of March. The Romans' rejection of monarchy was not merely a political preference. It was a foundational trauma, a defining wound, an origin story of its own. And what they built in monarchy's place, the Roman Republic, would prove to be one of the most consequential political experiments in human history. Chapter 4. The Republic, Power, Class, and the Slow Birth of Law. 2 men. That was the solution. 2 men, elected annually, each with the absolute power to veto the other. The Romans called this office consul, from a word meaning to deliberate together. They gave the consuls the full executive power of the former king's command of the armies, supervision of the treasury, authority over the courts, but they constrained that power with 3 mechanisms so elegant in their mutual reinforcement that it's worth pausing to appreciate them. First, collegiality. Each consul had exactly the same power as the other, and each could veto any decision of the other. This was deliberately cumbersome. The Romans designed inefficiency into the system because they had concluded correctly, given what they had just lived through. That efficient one-man rule was a far more dangerous thing than the occasional governmental deadlock. Second, annuality. Consuls served for exactly 1 year. At the end of that year, they became private citizens again, subject to the laws they had just been enforcing. The incentive this created for not abusing your position is obvious. Third, accountability. After their term, consuls could be prosecuted for misdeeds during their time in office. This concentrated Roman magistrates' minds wonderfully on the subject of avoiding misdeeds. It was, in short, a system designed by people who had been governed very badly and were determined with the slightly desperate thoroughness of people who have recently endured a tyrant not to allow it to happen again. Those who remember the debates about unchecked executive power during their own lifetimes will recognize the impulse immediately. The Romans were not unique in this concern, but they were particularly systematic about addressing it. The Senate, the Council of Elders that had existed in some form since the earliest days of the kings, became, in the Republic, the dominant institution of Roman government. It was not, in theory, a legislative body. The Roman Senate could not pass laws. It issued decrees senatus consulta, which were recommendations that the elected magistrates were expected to follow. In practice, this distinction was largely meaningless. A decree of the Senate carried the weight of a law simply because no Roman magistrate who wished to have any further political career would lightly ignore it. The Senate controlled the treasury, managed foreign policy, governed the provinces, and determined the allocation of military commands. It was, in practice, the closest thing Rome had to a permanent governing executive, a body of men, and it was always, throughout the Republic, entirely men who provided continuity across the annual turnover of elected magistrates. But the Senate was not a democracy, and this created a problem that would simmer and occasionally erupt throughout the entire history of the Republic. The Senate was composed entirely of former magistrates, men who had held the office of consul, or praetor, or quaestor. Magistrates were elected from the class of citizens called the patricians, the old families, the hereditary aristocracy of Rome, the descendants, or claimed descendants, of the senators of the royal period, which meant that everything flowed from a single hereditary class, and everyone outside that class, the vast majority of Rome's population, had, in the early Republic, essentially no formal voice in the governance of the state that relied on them to fill its armies and work its farms and build its roads. These were the plebeians, the common people of Rome. They ranged from wealthy merchants and successful craftsmen to impoverished day laborers and freed slaves. What they had in common was not poverty, but exclusion from formal political power. A wealthy plebeian merchant who paid his taxes, served in the army, and supported a household of 20 might be more economically significant than a down-at-heel patrician family clinging to its ancestral status, with nothing left but a prestigious name and mounting debts. But, in the early Republic, that merchants' sons could not hold high magistracies, could not sit in the Senate, could not marry into patrician families, and could not access the priestly offices that controlled religious life. The conflict of the orders, as historians call the 2 centuries of political struggle between the patrician class and the plebeians, was the defining domestic drama of the early Roman Republic. It was fought not on battlefields but in assemblies, and through the weapon of the secessio, the strike, in modern terms. On at least 2 and possibly more occasions, the plebeians of Rome simply left. They withdrew from the city and assembled on a nearby hill, making clear that without them, without their labor, their military service, their tax contributions, Rome would cease to function. It is, in its essentials, the first well-documented general strike in Western history. And it worked. The result of these secessions and the century-long political pressure they represented was a series of reforms that gradually opened Roman political life to the plebeian class. The most important of these, and one of the most significant political achievements of the ancient world, was the publication of the 12 Tables in 450 BCE. For the first time in Rome's history, the law was written down, publicly displayed, and accessible in principle to any citizen who could read. Before the 12 Tables, the law was an oral tradition controlled entirely by the patrician priests, who interpreted it and who could, in practice, interpret it however was most convenient for them. The plebeians had demanded written law for a very simple reason. If the law is not written down, those in power will say whatever they like and call it the law. The 12 Tables did not solve this problem entirely, but they made it considerably harder to get away with. The 12 Tables covered an extraordinary range of daily life. They addressed inheritance, debt, property, marriage, guardianship, legal procedure, the rights of freedmen, and the handling of the dead, including, interestingly, a prohibition against burying the deceased within the city limits, which tells you something about the public health consciousness of 5th century BCE Romans. They were blunt documents written in archaic Latin and deeply, at times bafflingly specific, the kind of specificity you get when you're trying to close every loophole that unscrupulous people have been exploiting for generations. They permitted a father to sell a son into slavery 3 times before the son was legally emancipated, which sounds barbaric and was, but they also prohibited a magistrate from passing a law that applied only to one citizen rather than to all citizens, which was a genuinely revolutionary constraint on the abuse of power. Those of you who spent careers navigating contracts, regulations, and the occasional encounter with legal fine print will appreciate the Roman instinct here. Written law is imperfect. Written law can be badly written, arbitrarily applied, and manipulated by those with the resources to hire advocates. But written law is, on balance, considerably more equitable than the alternative, which is law that exists only in the heads of the people who benefit most from controlling it. The conflict of the orders would not be fully resolved until the Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE, which finally gave the plebeian assembly, the Concilium Plebis, the power to pass laws binding on all Romans, including the patricians. It took 2 full centuries of political struggle, secession, negotiation, and incremental reform. And throughout it all, Rome was simultaneously fighting wars on every side against the Etruscans to the north, against the Samnites to the south, against the Latin League, against the Gauls, who sacked the city itself in 387 BCE and nearly ended the Roman experiment in a single catastrophic afternoon. We'll talk about the Gauls. That particular story deserves its own careful telling. The Gauls who sacked Rome in 387 BCE were Celtic warriors from the Po Valley, moving south under a chieftain named Brennus. They defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River and then walked into Rome, which had been largely abandoned by its population, most of whom had evacuated to nearby Allied cities, carrying whatever they could manage. A garrison of Roman soldiers held the Capitoline Hill. The rest of the city, the Forum, the temples, the early public buildings, all of it was burned. The Romans who survived regrouped, raised a ransom, and paid the Gauls to leave. The ransom was weighed in gold, and the Gauls' scales were rigged. And when the Romans complained, Brennus threw his sword onto the scale as well, and spoke the words that Rome would not forget for a generation: Vae Victis. Woe to the conquered. Rome rebuilt. Of course it did. Rome had been rebuilding since Romulus, and the Romans had developed a certain weary expertise in the process. The city that rose from the ashes of the Gallic sack was rebuilt quickly, almost too quickly, without the careful city planning that a more deliberate people might have applied. Streets went up where streets had been before, without particular attention to geometry or drainage, or the organized layout that the Romans would eventually impose on every provincial city they founded. Rome itself remained, for most of its history, an organically chaotic city, even as it grew to 1 million inhabitants, a tangle of narrow streets and towering apartment blocks and ancient religious precincts that could not be moved without offending the gods, built atop the bones of a city that had burned and been rebuilt multiple times over. It is here, in this period of rebuilding and political consolidation, that the character of the Roman Republic begins to take the shape that would carry it through the next 2 centuries of extraordinary expansion. The consular system, the Senate, the slow democratization of the plebeian class, the written law, the rebuilding from catastrophe. All of these things together produced a Roman citizen of the mid-4th century BCE who was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkable creature. Literate, in many cases, legally aware, politically engaged through a network of assemblies and voting procedures, conscious of belonging to something larger than his household or his neighborhood, and possessed of a particular stubborn conviction that Rome was worth fighting for, rebuilding after, and dying in defense of. The Roman army in the mid-Republic was not a professional standing army in the way that Rome would later develop. It was a citizen militiamen who owned property above a certain value, and who were therefore required to serve when the consuls called. They served for the campaign season, generally spring to autumn, and then returned to their farms and workshops. They brought their own equipment, at least in the early period, which meant that the wealthier classes, who could afford bronze breastplates, shields, and swords, served in the heavy infantry, while the less wealthy served as lighter-armed skirmishers. This had an interesting social dimension. Your military role was literally determined by your economic class, and your economic class was determined in part by your success in previous military service, since successful wars produced plunder and land grants. The system was circular in a way that eventually produced enormous social tensions. But in the 4th century BCE, it produced armies of motivated citizen soldiers who had a very personal stake in the success of Rome's wars. Those who served, or whose fathers served, or who kept things running at home while others were away will understand the texture of what that world felt like from the inside. The separation of the military season from the agricultural season was not just logistical. It shaped families. It shaped what children learned from fathers who were home only part of the year. It shaped women who managed farms and households through entire campaign seasons, making decisions that formal law may not have recognized as theirs to make, but which necessity made theirs regardless. We have fragments of evidence, inscriptions, legal records, occasional literary references of Roman women in the Republican period managing substantial property, conducting legal affairs through male proxies required by law, but directed entirely by female intelligence, and in a handful of remarkable cases, making public political interventions that shaped events. The formal record underrepresents them, as formal records tend to do. The actual history includes them rather more prominently. By 300 BCE, the Roman Republic had survived the Gallic sack, resolved the worst of the conflict of the orders, built a network of Latin alliances across central Italy, and developed a constitutional system that, while imperfect and burdened with class inequality, was at least functioning in the sense that its institutions were being used by the people they were supposed to serve. And then Rome encountered Carthage. Carthage was a Phoenician city-state on the North African coast, in what is now Tunisia, and by 300 BCE, it was the dominant naval and commercial power of the Western Mediterranean. It controlled the trade routes of the Western Sea. It had colonies in Sicily and Sardinia and Spain, and its commercial navy was the largest in the world. Rome had barely set foot in a boat. The collision between these two powers, the dominant land empire of the Italian peninsula and the dominant sea empire of the Western Mediterranean, would produce the most destructive wars the ancient world had ever seen, and would transform Rome from a regional Italian power into a world empire. That transformation is where part 2 of tonight's journey will take us. But before we get to the Punic Wars, to Hannibal crossing the Alps with 37 war elephants in November, which deserves to be told at appropriate length, we need to stop here in the late Republic and ask the question I promised at the beginning of tonight. Remember, at the very start, before we settled in, I asked how a civilization of 1 million people, the inventors of concrete and central heating and the legal code that underpins our own, could shrink to 30,000 people grazing cattle in the ruins of their own forum. We're not quite ready to answer it yet. That answer requires understanding what Rome built, and how it built it, and what it felt like from the inside to live in the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. But we're closer to it than we were an hour ago, and so we ease forward a little further into Rome, a little deeper into the lives of the people who made it. Chapter 5. Hannibal at the gates, the Punic Wars, and the world Rome made. In 264 BCE, Rome went to war with Carthage over Sicily. This requires some context, because on the face of it, it seems a remarkable decision. Rome was a land power. It had no navy worth mentioning. Carthage controlled the Western Mediterranean with a fleet that had been dominant for over a century. Any rational strategic analysis would have identified the Carthaginian navy as Rome's greatest disadvantage, one that would take generations to address and might never be fully overcome. The Romans looked at this situation, considered it carefully, and then did something that would become one of their defining characteristics. They decided to solve the problem immediately by copying what worked. A Carthaginian ship ran aground on the Italian coast early in the First Punic War, and the Romans took it apart, studied it exhaustively, and used it as a template to build 130 copies in roughly 60 days. There are several things wrong with that sentence from a modern shipbuilding perspective, and ancient sources may be exaggerating the timeline, but the underlying truth is accurate. Rome built a war fleet from almost nothing in an extraordinarily short time, by reverse engineering a captured enemy vessel and applying the organizational capacity of the Roman state, which was, at this point, the thing Rome did best to the problem of mass production. They also invented a boarding device, the corvus, a spiked gangplank that could be dropped onto an enemy ship to lock it in place and allow Roman soldiers to storm across and fight the kind of land battle that Roman soldiers were very good at, rather than the maritime maneuvering that Carthaginian crews had practiced for generations. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, from 264 to 241 BCE Rome won. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary military and logistical achievement. A land power had become a naval power through sheer institutional will, lost several fleets to storms and Carthaginian engagements, rebuilt after each disaster, and ultimately prevailed. The Romans described their naval disasters with that characteristic dry understatement. One storm off the coast of Sicily in 255 BCE destroyed nearly 300 warships and drowned approximately 100,000 men. The Senate ordered new ships built. The survivors were sent back. There was no serious discussion of giving up. 23 years, a war that lasted longer than most of the people fighting it could remember a time before it began. Entire generations of Roman and Carthaginian men grew up knowing nothing but this war, were shaped by nothing but this war, and in very large numbers died in this war. We do not have reliable casualty figures for the ancient world. The numbers given by ancient historians are consistently unreliable in ways that make modern military historians visibly uncomfortable at professional conferences. But the scale is not in doubt. The First Punic War was one of the largest military conflicts the ancient world had ever seen, and it was not even, by Roman standards, the worst of the three. But the most consequential development of the Punic Wars was not in the end the first one, it was the second. And at the center of the Second Punic War stands one of the most remarkable military minds the ancient world produced, a man whose campaign across the Alps remains, 22 centuries later, one of the most audacious military maneuvers in recorded history. Hannibal Barca was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a Carthaginian general who had fought Rome in the First Punic War and never forgiven the result. Family legend held that when the young Hannibal begged to accompany his father to Spain, Hamilcar asked if he truly understood what he was requesting. Hannibal said he did. Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son swear on the altar of the gods that he would be an enemy of Rome forever. Whether this story is exactly true, the Romans clearly believed it, and they were not wrong about the result. In 218 BCE, Hannibal marched an army of approximately 80,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants out of Carthaginian-controlled Spain and across the Alps into Italy. In November, in the Western Alps, which in November are not a pleasant environment under any circumstances, he lost roughly half his army to the cold, to mountain ambushes by alpine tribesmen, to sheer exhaustion, and to the particular indignity of trying to move war elephants through mountain passes at altitude in winter, which is an experience that appears to have diminished the elephant populations significantly. Those who served in Korea or endured the winter of the Ardennes will understand in their bones what cold does to an army, how it unmans the most determined fighters, how equipment fails and food freezes, and the simple act of moving forward requires a quality of will that goes beyond tactics or training. Hannibal's army crossed the Alps in approximately 15 days. What arrived in the Po Valley was roughly half the army that had set out, about 26,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The elephants, all 37 of them, had survived the crossing. Most of them would not survive the Italian campaign. Hannibal then proceeded to spend 15 years in Italy, 15 years without ever being driven out, without ever losing a major battle on Italian soil, and without ever receiving the reinforcements or supplies he'd been promised from Carthage. He inflicted 3 catastrophic defeats on Rome in 3 successive years: Trebia in 218, Trasimene in 217, and Cannae in 216 BCE, at which he surrounded and destroyed a Roman army of somewhere between 50 and 70,000 men in a single afternoon. Cannae is still studied at military academies around the world. Hannibal's double envelopment, the maneuver by which a smaller force encircles a larger one, became the foundational template for offensive tactical thinking in Western military history. George Patton, who had opinions about most things, reportedly carried a copy of Polybius's account of Cannae with him throughout the Second World War. And yet, Hannibal lost. He lost despite never losing a major battle in Italy. He lost despite turning several of Rome's Italian allies against her. He lost because Rome refused to behave like a civilization that had been beaten. After Cannae, with somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers dead in a single afternoon, a figure that strains comprehension even by the industrialized slaughter of the 20th century, the Senate met. Several members suggested opening peace negotiations. The former dictator, Fabius Maximus, who had earned the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer, for his strategy of avoiding pitched battle with Hannibal, advised precisely this. The Senate majority rejected peace. The rejected delegation from Carthage was told that Rome did not negotiate while enemy armies stood on Italian soil. Rome levied new armies, including, for the first time in significant numbers, men below the property threshold normally required for military service. Rome armed slaves and gave them freedom in exchange for service. Rome melted down the gold and silver offerings from its temples and used them to pay for the war. And Rome found, eventually, the general who could beat Hannibal by refusing to fight him on Italian soil, a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would take the war to Africa and defeat the Carthaginian army on its home ground at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Hannibal was recalled to Carthage to defend his own city. The undefeated general, finally defeated on African soil, by the one opponent who had studied him carefully enough to borrow his own tactics. Scipio, given the honorific Africanus for his victory, returned to Rome as one of the most celebrated generals in the Republic's history. Hannibal was exiled and would eventually take his own life in Bithynia in 183 BCE at an age somewhere in his 60s, reportedly saying that he would spare the Romans the trouble of waiting for an old general to die. It is, as Roman epitaphs go, a rather good one. The Third Punic War, which began in 149 BCE, lasted only 3 years. It was not, by Punic War standards, a close contest. Rome had decided, for a combination of strategic and frankly vindictive reasons, that Carthage had to be destroyed entirely, not defeated, not pacified, not made a province, but physically erased. The phrase often attributed to the senator Cato, the elder, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, was reportedly appended to every speech he gave to the Senate, regardless of the topic under discussion, for years. Whatever your view of the policy, you have to admire the commitment. Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general who commanded the final siege of Carthage, reportedly wept when the city fell. He quoted Homer, the passage about the fall of Troy, and reportedly said that he feared for Rome, that all great cities eventually fell, and that he was watching the future in the present. His biographer Polybius, who was present and asked him what he meant, records the exchange. Whether or not the account is entirely accurate, the Romans clearly thought it was the kind of thing a reflective general would say at such a moment. And it is, from the perspective of someone standing in the ruins of the Forum in 600 CE, watching cattle graze over the cracked marble, rather prescient. Remember, we are building toward the answer to that question. But first, we need to understand what the century of conquest did to the people who lived through it. Because the same victories that gave Rome an empire were already planting the seeds of its eventual fracture. Chapter 6. What conquest does to a society. Winners, losers, and the changing face of Rome. Victory is expensive. Not in the way defeat is expensive, naturally. But the costs of sustained military success are less obvious and in some ways more insidious, because they arrive dressed as benefits. Rome's military success across the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE brought the Republic wealth on a scale that had no historical precedent in the Italian world. Shiploads of silver and gold arrived from Spain. The ransacking of Macedon and Greece brought art and luxury goods and educated Greek slaves to Rome, in quantities that transformed Roman culture permanently. The conquest of Asia Minor introduced spices, fine textiles, and philosophical traditions that the Romans had not previously encountered. The destruction of Carthage eliminated Rome's last serious commercial competitor in the Western Mediterranean, opening trade routes worth fortunes. But wealth, when it arrives unevenly, does not simply enrich, it restructures. And the restructuring of Roman society in the wake of the Punic Wars was profound, disruptive, and ultimately catastrophic for the political institutions the Republic had spent 3 centuries building. The problem was the small farmer, the free, property-owning citizen soldier smallholder who had been the backbone of the Roman army and the foundation of Roman social theory, had, by the mid-2nd century BCE, been largely destroyed as a class, not by defeat, by victory. The wars had required these men to serve for years at a stretch, leaving their farms in the care of wives and elderly fathers. Some farms survived this. Many did not. Meanwhile, the conquest of new territories created vast amounts of public land ager publicus, which was theoretically available to all citizens, but in practice was being occupied and worked by the wealthy patrician and equestrian class, using the enslaved people they had acquired cheaply from the same wars. A Roman soldier returning from a 3-year campaign in Spain or Macedonia in the mid-2nd century BCE might find his family's small farm abandoned or sold for debt, the surrounding land absorbed into a wealthy neighbor's growing estate, and no clear path back to the economic stability that had defined his family's place in the world for generations. He and his family would cut drift to Rome, that universal destination of the dispossessed throughout history, adding to the swelling population of the urban poor. He would lose his property qualification for military service. He would become, in the technical Roman term, a proletarius, one who contributed to the state only through his children, having no taxable property to offer. He would be angry, he would have company, and eventually, there are always eventually moments in these stories someone with political skill would notice this anger and decide it was useful. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, grandsons of Scipio Africanus on their mother's side, which tells you something about how thoroughly the best families were entangled with both the glory and the problems of the Roman Republic. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE and immediately proposed legislation to redistribute the ager publicus, the public land that wealthy families had occupied, in excess of the legal limits to landless Romans. The Senate, composed almost entirely of the wealthy families in question, was not enthusiastic about this proposal. What the Senate did was, by Roman constitutional standards, deeply irregular. They organized a mob of senators and their clients, armed with whatever was to hand: benches, chair legs, the kind of improvised weaponry that suggests the planning was perhaps not meticulous, and they clubbed Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his supporters to death in the streets of Rome. This was the first large-scale political murder in the history of the Roman Republic. It would not be the last. His younger brother Gaius took up his work a decade later, as tribune in 123 and 122 BCE, expanding the land reform program and adding further provisions for the urban poor grain subsidies, road-building contracts, colonial settlements. He was rather more systematic about it than Tiberius, and rather more skilled politically. The Senate arranged for him to be stripped of his position, and, when Gaius organized his supporters on the Aventine, sent a force against him. Gaius Gracchus had a slave kill him before he could be captured. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers are, in retrospect, the moment the Roman Republic crossed a line it could not uncross. Not because political murder was new to human civilization, it was very much not, but because the Roman Republic, specifically, had spent 200 years building the principle that political disputes were resolved through institutions, through elections, through vetoes, through the legal procedures of the 12 tables and their successors, through the mechanisms of the Senate and the assemblies. Once political murder became an accepted tool of Roman political life, those institutions began to erode with a speed that is painful to watch from across 22 centuries. The people who used violence to stop the Gracchi were certain they were protecting the Republic. They were doing precisely the opposite. There is a lesson in there that history has not, on the available evidence, taught especially effectively. But tonight we document rather than prescribe, and the documentation is clear enough on its own terms. Those of you who lived through periods when democratic institutions came under pressure, and several such periods have occurred within living memory for most watching tonight, may find the Roman pattern disturbingly familiar. The comment section is yours if you'd like to share your thoughts. I'm curious what this audience makes of the comparison. Chapter 7. The Lives of Ordinary Romans. Work, food, and the street-level view. Most Romans, the vast majority of the people who lived in the city that would grow to 1 million inhabitants by the 1st century BCE, were not senators or generals or wealthy merchants. They were shopkeepers and craftsmen and freed people and laborers and the enslaved. They lived in the insulae, the apartment blocks that gave Rome its vertical density, in rooms that were small and dark and did not have kitchens, since the fire risk in a multi-story wooden and mud brick building was extreme. And in fact, fires in the insulae were a routine feature of Roman urban life, rather than a notable exception. The apartment dweller of Republican Rome ate most of their food outside the home at one of the thermopolium establishments that lined the city's streets, the ancient equivalent of a diner counter, where cooked food was kept warm in ceramic vessels embedded in a stone counter, and you could buy a meal standing up for a few coins. The menu was not elaborate by modern standards. Bread was the staple. Rome consumed extraordinary quantities of bread, and the grain supply that fed the city's bread was the single most politically sensitive logistical issue in Roman governance. Disruption to the grain supply produced food riots with a reliability that every Roman politician understood intimately. Beyond bread, legumes, olives and olive oil, vegetables, salted fish, some meat for those who could afford it, and garum, the fermented fish sauce that the Romans put on essentially everything, with the enthusiasm of a civilization that had discovered a condiment and saw no reason for moderation. The nights in Rome were loud in ways that are remarkable to contemplate. The city banned wheeled vehicles from the streets during daylight hours to manage the congestion, which meant that all the commercial traffic of a city of ultimately 1 million people moved after dark, in carts and wagons whose iron-shod wheels on stone paving created a noise that ancient sources describe as constant and sleep-destroying. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, complained that you could only sleep in Rome if you were very wealthy, which meant you could afford an upper-floor room away from the street noise, or very drunk, which meant you couldn't hear it anyway. The problems of urban living, apparently, are fairly consistent across 2 millennia. The public baths, the thermae, were where much of the real social life of Rome occurred, and they were one of the most genuinely democratic institutions the city possessed. For the price of a small copper coin, any free citizen could spend several hours in a complex that would have included heated changing rooms, a cold plunge bath, a warm bath, a hot steam room, exercise grounds, libraries, snack vendors, and a level of socialization that crossed class boundaries more freely than almost any other Roman institution. Senators and shopkeepers sweated together in the same steam rooms. Whether they discussed politics in that context, we can reasonably assume. The Roman calendar was organized around an extensive cycle of public festivals and games that served both religious and social functions, and, from the perspective of the Roman government, the politically important function of providing entertainment to an increasingly restive urban population. The phrase usually rendered in modern discussions as bread and circuses, panem et circenses, from Juvenal again, has been somewhat unfairly reduced to a cynical management tool. It was that, certainly, but it was also a genuine expression of Roman civic culture, the idea that the state had obligations to its citizens that went beyond mere governance. Chariot racing drew crowds of 250,000 people to the Circus Maximus, a figure that remained the largest sporting venue in the world until the modern era, and which puts any contemporary stadium attendance into some perspective. 4 racing teams competed: the blues, greens, reds, and whites, and the factional loyalties these teams inspired were, by all accounts, quite as intense as any modern sports rivalry and considerably more likely to produce lethal street violence. The Romans took their entertainment seriously. The gladiatorial games have attracted far more attention in modern popular culture than they perhaps deserve as a lens on Roman society, partly because they are the most visually dramatic element of Roman entertainment, and partly because they confirm certain narratives about Roman brutality that modern audiences find satisfying to contemplate. They were real, they were brutal, and they did involve death, although the death rates among professional gladiators were considerably lower than popular imagination suggests, because a trained gladiator represented a significant financial investment, and arena owners were not inclined to waste their inventory. They were also, by the standards of Roman public spectacle, only one element of a much broader culture of public entertainment that included theatrical performances, athletic competitions, public poetry recitations, and the kind of musical performances that we have essentially no recordings of, which is one of history's more unfortunate archival gaps. Let's talk about the enslaved people of Rome, because their story is inseparable from any honest account of how Roman civilization functioned, and it is a story that the Romans themselves had varying and often contradictory attitudes toward. At the height of the empire, perhaps 1 in 3 people in Rome was enslaved. In the agricultural heartland of Italy, the ratio was higher. In Sicily, where Rome's slave rebellions first broke out in 135 BCE and again in 104 BCE, enslaved people on the latifundia outnumbered free people significantly. The Roman institution of slavery was different from the chattel slavery of the Americas. In important ways, it was not racially defined. And manumission, the granting of freedom, was both legal and common, to the point where a significant proportion of Rome's free citizen population was composed of freed people and their descendants. But it was not, by any imaginable standard, humane. Eunice, a Syrian-born enslaved man who claimed prophetic powers and led the first Sicilian slave revolt, reportedly organized an army of 70,000 enslaved people, seized multiple Sicilian cities, and controlled much of the island for several years before Roman forces finally suppressed the revolt. He was captured rather than killed, and died in Roman custody around 132 BCE, a fact that suggests the Romans were, characteristically, more interested in keeping him as a symbol of defeat than in making him a martyr. His revolt, and those that followed, including the most famous one of Spartacus in 73 to 71 BCE, did not end Roman slavery. They did not even significantly reduce it. What they produced was a heightened anxiety among the slaveholding class, a set of increasingly brutal provisions for preventing and punishing collective resistance. And buried under all of that a set of philosophical debates among Roman intellectuals about whether slavery was natural, necessary, or morally justifiable. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, argued that enslaved people were fully human, that their condition was an accident of fortune that could have befallen anyone, and that masters should treat them as fellow human beings. He did not argue for abolition, but the fact that a senator of his standing felt compelled to argue for basic human dignity for enslaved people suggests that the question was at least being asked. 6,000 crosses from Capua to Rome. The Romans recorded it matter-of-factly. It was intended as a deterrent. Whether it functioned as one is difficult to measure, though the subsequent centuries of Roman history did not produce another revolt on Spartacus's scale. Whether that represents the deterrent's success, or simply the more sophisticated management systems that followed is, as historians debate many things, genuinely unclear. We document this not to dwell in horror, but because the history of Rome cannot be honestly told without it. The civilization that built the aqueducts and wrote the legal code and produced the philosophers and the engineers was built on this foundation as well. The two truths coexist. They always do, in the history of any civilization that achieved greatness through means that included the systematic subjugation of other human beings. Understanding Rome requires holding both of those truths simultaneously, which is an uncomfortable but honest way to approach history. Chapter 8. Concrete, Water, and the Infrastructure of a Million People. Now, here is the part that still puzzles engineers and historians alike. The thing I mentioned at the very beginning of tonight's journey. The question of how a civilization that produced this disappears. Hold that thought a little longer. Before we can answer it, we need to understand exactly how impressive what Rome built actually was. Because what Rome built was, by any reasonable standard, astonishing. The aqueducts. 11 major aqueducts served the city of Rome at the height of the empire, delivering over 1 million cubic meters of water per day, roughly 1,000 liters per person, per day, for a city of 1 million people. For comparison, the United Nations today defines adequate water access as 50 liters per person per day. Rome was delivering 20 times the modern minimum standard of adequacy to every neighborhood of the largest city in the Western world, powered entirely by gravity. No pumps, no electricity, no moving parts beyond the water itself. Just carefully calculated gradients, maintained over distances of up to 100 kilometers that ensured water arrived at the city at the precise pressure and volume required. Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as curator aquarum, the superintendent of Rome's aqueducts, in the late 1st century CE, wrote a 2-volume technical treatise on the aqueduct system that is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from antiquity. He documented the gradients, the pipe sizes, the maintenance schedules, the water distribution rights, the history of each aqueduct, and, with an admirably direct satisfaction, the water theft problem. Rome had a significant water theft problem. People tapped into the distribution pipes illegally, bribed maintenance workers to expand their allotments, and built unauthorized connections to the public supply. Frontinus pursued these arrangements with the energetic displeasure of a man who had been handed an infrastructure asset and discovered it was being systematically stolen. Some things, apparently, do not change across 2,000 years of civilization. Roman concrete opus caementicium was another of those Roman innovations that is considerably more technically impressive than it appears at first. The Pantheon's dome, completed in its current form around 125 CE during the reign of Hadrian, is 142 feet in diameter and remains to this day the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It has stood for 19 centuries without significant structural maintenance. Engineers who have studied it report that the aggregate used in the concrete was carefully calibrated by density heavier stone at the base, pumice, a light volcanic material, at the top, reducing the load at the critical upper portion of the dome and distributing the structural forces in ways that modern engineers consider, without embarrassment, to be sophisticated. The oculus, the circular opening at the dome's center, is open to the sky. It always has been. When it rains in Rome, it rains inside the Pantheon. The floor has a slight concavity and a drain at the center which handles it. The Romans were not careless about this detail. They simply understood that a space intended to honor all the gods probably ought to have a direct connection to the heavens, and they built accordingly. There is something in that, the willingness to let the weather in, to accept the practical inconvenience of the real open sky as a non-negotiable feature that feels very Roman. The roads, of course, need mentioning, because the Roman road system is the infrastructure achievement most people associate with Rome, and the association is entirely warranted. At the empire's peak, the road network extended roughly 50,000 miles of paved road and perhaps 200,000 miles of secondary road. The Roman mile, the Milla Passuum, 1,000 double steps, was approximately 1,480 modern meters, and milestones were placed at regular intervals along every major road. A message from Rome could reach the furthest corners of the empire by the imperial post system, the cursus publicus, in weeks rather than months. The Roman road network was not built primarily for commercial convenience. It was built for the army. Every Roman road was, at its core, a military logistics system, a means of moving legions and their supplies from the center to the periphery with the minimum possible delay. The commercial traffic was a benefit, not the purpose. The same is true, incidentally, of the United States interstate highway system, which was built in the 1950s partly as a civilian infrastructure project, but substantially as a Cold War military logistics network, designed to move troops and materiel across the continent in the event of emergency. Some things, as noted previously, are fairly consistent across civilizations. Those who remember the construction of the interstate system may find the Roman parallel, if you'll excuse the pun, rather direct. This is where we are now, at the end of Part 2, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era at Rome's height. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which the historian Edward Gibbon would later identify as the period when the human race was most happily governed. Gibbon was not wrong about the infrastructure. He was perhaps overly sanguine about the experience of being governed, which depended rather heavily on whether you were a senator or a slave. But by the metrics of stability, economic activity, civic amenity, and the number of people with access to clean water and cooked food and legal recourse, the 1st and 2nd centuries CE were, for a significant portion of the people living in the Roman world, something like a functioning civilization, which makes what comes next considerably more difficult to look at directly. The answer to the question we posed at the beginning, how a million-person city becomes a herd of cattle in the Forum, begins not with the barbarians at the gates, and not with a military defeat, and not with a single catastrophic event. It begins inside, with a series of crises that the Roman system had been building toward for centuries, accelerating into the 3rd century CE, and producing a collapse that was, in retrospect, both shocking and entirely predictable. And that is exactly where Part 3 will take us into the century of crisis. The soldier emperors, the plagues, the fractures, and the extraordinary, desperate, ultimately insufficient attempts to hold together something that was slowly losing the will to remain whole. Chapter 9. The Death of the Republic. Caesar, Blood, and the Ides of March. The Roman Republic did not fall in a day. It fell across several decades of escalating political violence institutional dysfunction, and the progressive discovery by a succession of ambitious men that the mechanisms designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power could, with sufficient military backing, simply be ignored. Gaius Julius Caesar was the most gifted of these men, and in certain respects the most tragic, in the precise sense that tragedy implies a figure of genuine greatness who contains within his greatness the seeds of his own destruction. He was a general of extraordinary ability. His campaigns in Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE added an enormous territory to the Roman world, produced a personal army loyal to him rather than to the state, and made him fabulously wealthy from the plunder. He was a writer of lucid, elegant prose. His account of the Gallic Wars, written in the third person with a disarming modesty that convinces no one, is still studied in Latin classrooms today. He was a politician who understood that the populares, the faction that appealed to the interests of ordinary Romans rather than the aristocracy, represented both a genuine political constituency and a personal power base. He crossed the Rubicon in January of 49 BCE, the small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary beyond which Roman law forbade a general to bring his army. It was, technically, an act of treason. It was also, as subsequent events demonstrated, irreversible. The phrase, crossing the Rubicon, meaning a point of no return, has survived in the vocabulary of 22 languages. Caesar himself, by Suetonius's account, said only, "Alia iacta est." The die is cast. The Senate fled. His political opponents fled. Pompey, his former ally and now rival, fled to Greece and then to Egypt, where he was killed on the beach by a local official who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. Caesar, arriving in Egypt shortly after, reportedly wept when shown Pompey's severed head. They had been family. Once Pompey had married Caesar's daughter Julia, and by all accounts it had been a genuine marriage as well as a political one. Julia had died in 54 BCE, and with her death, perhaps the last human bond that might have kept the two men from outright war. Caesar spent the years following the civil war's end, 49 to 44 BCE, demonstrating both extraordinary administrative ability and a gift for political self-destruction that is remarkable given his intelligence. He reformed the calendar, producing the Julian calendar that the Western world used until the 1600s. He reorganized the grain dole. He founded colonies for his veterans. He began planning an infrastructure program that would have reshaped the city of Rome. He was, in short, governing well, in the way that competent autocrats sometimes do when they apply their abilities to administration rather than combat. And simultaneously, he was accumulating honors and titles that made every Roman who valued the republican tradition progressively more anxious. He accepted the dictatorship for life. The standard dictatorship was 6 months maximum. He allowed statues of himself to be placed among the gods. He wore the purple toga of triumph daily. He sat when the Senate came to him rather than rising, which was not a small thing in a culture that attached enormous significance to ceremonial respect. On the 15th of March, 44 BCE, a group of approximately 60 senators who called themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators, surrounded Julius Caesar during a Senate meeting in the theater of Pompeii and stabbed him 23 times. The physician who later examined the body concluded that only one wound had been fatal. 22 of the stab wounds had, for technical medical purposes, been unnecessary. Among the conspirators was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had treated as something close to a son, whose mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's closest companion for decades, and to whom Caesar had given his explicit protection and patronage. Whether Caesar actually said et tu, Brute, and you too, Brutus is something Shakespeare invented and historians doubt. But the Romans believed the story. which tells you what they thought the betrayal meant. The conspirators had not planned what came next. This, it must be said, reflects a certain narrowness of imagination that is astonishing in men who had been watching Roman politics for decades. They apparently believed that killing Caesar would restore the Republic, that the senatorial body would simply resume its traditional function, grateful for the removal of the tyrant, and that the Roman people would applaud. Instead, the crowd that gathered for Caesar's public funeral became so agitated by Mark Antony's oration over the body and by the sight of Caesar's wounded, blood-stained toga that they drove the conspirators from the city. Brutus and Cassius fled east. The Republic, which they had killed Caesar to restore, died with him in the same room. What followed was 14 more years of civil war, as Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian, 18 years old when Caesar died, rather undersized physically, constitutionally frail, and possessed of the most extraordinary political intelligence in Roman history, maneuvered, allied, betrayed, and outfought his way to sole power. By 31 BCE, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, Octavian was the last man standing. He was 32 years old. The Roman world was his. Chapter 10: Augustus Caesar and the Art of Pretending Not to Be a King. The genius of Octavian, who accepted the honorific title Augustus, meaning the revered one, in 27 BCE, was that he understood something the Gracchi and Caesar and every other ambitious Roman politician before him had failed to grasp. The Romans could tolerate almost any concentration of power, provided you did not call it what it was. Augustus held virtually every significant office in the Roman state simultaneously, for life. He commanded all the armies. He controlled the treasury. He governed the most strategically important provinces directly. He had the power of a tribune of the plebs, giving him the ability to veto any legislation. He had the power of a proconsul throughout the empire. In every functional sense, he was a monarch. And he spent 45 years from 27 BCE to his death in 14 CE, insisting that he was not. He called himself princeps, the first citizen, the first among equals in the Senate. He wore plain clothes. He lived in a relatively modest house on the Palatine compared to the palaces later emperors would build. He consulted the Senate on appointments and legislation, knowing perfectly well they would do what he suggested. He was, in the judgment of most historians, the most skilled political operator in Western history, and the evidence for that view is compelling. Augustus rebuilt Rome in marble. The famous boast that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble is his own, which means it should be treated with appropriate skepticism, but it is not entirely wrong. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars Ultor, the Ara Pacis, the Altar of Peace, and a dozen other monuments transformed the physical face of the city. He also reorganized the administration of the empire, created a permanent professional army in place of the citizen militia model, established the cursus publicus postal system, reformed the grain supply, and built, in short, the institutional infrastructure that would allow the empire to function for the next several centuries without requiring his personal attention at every crisis. He was, in addition to everything else, a competent manager. Augustus died in 14 CE at the age of 75, which was a rather remarkable lifespan for a man who had survived decades of civil war, 3 serious illnesses that contemporaries expected to kill him, and 45 years of the kind of stress that concentrated political power tends to generate. His last reported words, addressed to friends gathered at his bedside, were, "Have I played my part in the farce of life well enough? If I have, then applaud my exit." It is, considering everything, a remarkably self-aware epitaph from a man who had spent most of his adult life playing parts. The system Augustus created, the Principate, proved remarkably durable. Not every emperor who followed him was competent or sane or even vaguely interested in governing. Caligula spent 4 years demonstrating that absolute power, given to a young man who had grown up entirely within the distorted environment of the imperial court, could produce results that defy orderly description. Nero managed to burn Rome and kill his own mother in what historians generally consider to be suboptimal governance. And yet the empire survived them both. The bureaucracy kept functioning. The legions kept the frontiers. The grain kept arriving. The aqueducts kept flowing. The institutional infrastructure that Augustus had built was robust enough to persist through emperors who were making things considerably more difficult from the top. The period historians call the 5 good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, reigning from 96 to 180 EC, represents the closest approximation to Gibbon's happily governed world that Rome achieved. Each, with varying degrees of success, combined genuine administrative competence with the restraint of power that Augustus had modeled. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, adding Dacia and Mesopotamia. Hadrian pulled back from some of Trajan's more exposed acquisitions and built the wall in northern Britain that still bears his name. Antoninus Pius presided over a period of remarkable stability, so uneventful that his reign is difficult to write about in engaging terms, which is perhaps the highest compliment available to a Roman emperor. And Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign on campaign against Germanic tribes on the Danube frontier, while simultaneously writing the Meditations, a philosophical diary in Greek, never intended for publication, that has been continuously in print for 18 centuries, and is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary documents produced by a head of state in recorded history. What Marcus Aurelius wrote in those notebooks was not strategy or administration. It was philosophy, specifically, the practical application of Stoic thought to the experience of power and responsibility. He wrote about the impermanence of empire. He wrote about how every ruler who came before him was dust. He wrote about the obligation to serve not from desire for glory, but from duty to the whole of which one is a part. He knew, as well as anyone who had studied history carefully, that what he was presiding over would not last. The question was only how long and what would come after. Those of you who have watched institutions you believed in begin to show their age, who saw industries that seemed permanent become obsolete, or communities that seemed stable dissolve, or ways of life that seemed foundational simply end, may find Marcus Aurelius's tone rather familiar. History rarely ends dramatically from the inside. Mostly it thins out. If you've seen something like that in your own lifetime, the comment section below is yours. I'd genuinely like to hear what you think about watching things change around you. Chapter 11. The Opening Mystery. Answered, How Civilizations Forget Themselves. And now, here, at this point in our journey, I think we're ready. Remember what we asked at the very beginning of tonight? How does a city of 1 million people, the largest in the ancient world, become a grazing ground for cattle in less than 2 centuries? How does a civilization that invented the dome, the aqueduct, the legal code, and the professional army simply forget how to be itself? The answer is not one thing. It is never one thing with civilizations. The answer is a convergence, a series of pressures that any one of which might have been managed in isolation, but which arrived together and fed each other, in a sequence that, in retrospect, looks almost mechanical in its inevitability. The first pressure: money. The Roman Empire had been expanding for centuries, and expansion paid for itself New provinces generated tax revenue. New conquests produced plunder. New territories added agricultural and mineral resources. When expansion stopped, when the empire reached, under Hadrian, roughly the limits of what it could defend, this model collapsed. The army still needed paying. The bureaucracy still needed feeding. The public works still needed maintaining. But the income from new conquest was gone. The Roman state responded in ways that will seem eerily familiar. It debased the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius from roughly 90% under Augustus to less than 5% by the mid-3rd century CE. Currency debasement is inflation by another name, and the Roman population understood this with the directness of people who held the coins in their hands and noticed they were getting lighter. Merchants began to refuse debased coins or demand more of them. Prices rose. The army, paid in the debased currency, demanded pay increases that the state could not sustainably provide. Landowners converted from a money economy back to a barter economy. The sophisticated commercial network that had allowed a Roman merchant to send goods from Britain to Syria and receive payment in a universally accepted currency began to fragment. The second pressure, the army. The professional army Augustus had created was an extraordinary institution, disciplined, well-equipped, institutionally loyal to the imperial system. But by the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, something had shifted in that loyalty. The legions on the various frontiers had been stationed in the same places for generations. Their soldiers had married local women, raised families in the frontier towns, put down roots in the provinces where they served. They were Roman soldiers, but they were also Rhinelanders, and Danubians, and Syrians. Their primary loyalty was to their general and their unit, and their general was the man who could get them their pay, their bonuses, and their land grants on retirement, which meant their general was, in practice, the man who could make himself emperor. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 CE, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century Rome, had approximately 50 different emperors. 50. Some reigned for years, several reigned for months, a few lasted weeks. The mechanism was almost always the same. A frontier general was acclaimed emperor by his troops, marched on Rome or on a rival claimant, won or lost, and was either consolidated in power or assassinated by the next general with the same idea. The Senate, which had once been the gravitational center of Roman political life, became largely irrelevant. Emperors were made in army camps, not in the Senate house. The third pressure, and this one is the one that strikes most people as the most dramatic, though it was in many ways the most manageable of the three, was the external pressure of the peoples beyond Rome's borders. The Germanic tribes of the Rhine and Danube, the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east, the various nomadic confederations along the steppe frontier. None of these were simply passive threats waiting to exploit Roman weakness. They were peoples in motion, themselves often under pressure from further east, developing military technologies and organizational capabilities of their own. And the fourth pressure, often underestimated, was plague. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 CE and the Plague of Cyprian from 249 to 262 CE killed somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Roman population over the course of a century. The Roman Empire was, by the standards of the ancient world, unusually vulnerable to epidemic disease, precisely because it was so well connected. The same road network that moved armies and trade also moved pathogens, with a thoroughness that no frontier garrison could stop, and no physician of the period could identify or address. These four pressures, monetary crisis, military fragmentation, external invasion, and epidemic, arrived not sequentially, but simultaneously, each making the others worse. The monetary crisis meant the army couldn't be reliably paid, which fueled military fragmentation. Military fragmentation weakened the frontier defenses, enabling more frequent external pressure. The plague depopulated the countryside, reducing agricultural output and tax revenue, deepening the monetary crisis. The system began to eat itself, and here is the real answer to the question. Not the external invasions, not the debasement of the currency, not even the 50 emperors in 50 years. The answer is institutional erosion. The Roman Republic had survived the Gauls sacking the city in 387 BCE. It had survived Hannibal destroying army after army in Italy for 15 years. It had survived the social war, the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, and the convulsions of the late Republic. It survived because its institutions, the Senate, the legal system, the annual magistracies, the citizen assembly, provided continuity across individual disasters. When one consul died, another was elected. When one army was destroyed, another was levied. The institution was larger than any individual person or single catastrophe. What the crisis of the 3rd century destroyed was not Rome's physical infrastructure or Rome's military capacity. It destroyed confidence in the institutions. When 50 generals could make themselves emperor in 50 years, the Senate had clearly lost its stabilizing function. When the currency debased to 5% silver, the legal and commercial framework that depended on a reliable medium of exchange fragmented. When the frontier legions' loyalty ran to their general rather than to the abstract state, the army's function as a defense of civilization became indistinguishable from its function as a political instrument of personal ambition. The Romans knew something was wrong. They were not stupid, and they were not passive. The 3rd and 4th centuries produced a series of extraordinary reform efforts: Diocletian's administrative reorganization, Constantine's religious transformation, the permanent division of the empire into western and eastern halves for administrative efficiency. Each of these was, in its own right, a remarkable act of institutional creativity. None of them, ultimately, was enough. Diocletian understood that the crisis of imperial legitimacy required a response at the level of political theater as much as administration. He adopted the elaborate ceremonial of the Eastern court, the divine honors, the elaborate prostration required of those entering his presence, the gold-embroidered robes and jeweled diadem. He was no longer the princeps, the first among equals. He was Dominus, the Lord, the word from which we get the English domination. This was, in its way, honest. It acknowledged that the fiction of the principate, the pretense that the emperor was simply a citizen who happened to hold all significant offices, was no longer sustainable. But abandoning the fiction cost something too. Augustus's genius had been to use the forms of the Republic to legitimate his power. Diocletian abandoned the forms, and the legitimacy became nakedly transactional. He also divided the empire administratively into 4 portions, each governed by a senior or junior emperor, the arrangement known as the Tetrarchy. It was a rational solution to the problem of governing a territory too large for one man to personally oversee. It lasted about a generation before the men involved began fighting each other for sole control, which, given everything we know about the Roman imperial system by this point, was entirely predictable. Spoiler, it didn't work. Chapter 12. Constantine, Christianity, and the Empire Remade. Christianity had been spreading through the Roman Empire for roughly 3 centuries before Constantine's reign. The process had been neither uniform nor uncontested. Intermittent persecutions, most famously under Nero and Diocletian, had killed significant numbers of Christians and driven the religion underground at intervals. But the persecutions had not stopped the spread. If anything, they had accelerated it. by producing martyrs whose stories circulated with a speed that the Roman road network made practically useful for the first time in religious history. Constantine's conversion or political embrace, depending on how one interprets the evidence, changed everything. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted Christians legal tolerance throughout the empire. Constantine returned confiscated church property, built enormous basilica churches in Rome and in the new eastern capital he was constructing at Constantinople, and began the process of making Christianity not merely tolerated but actively favored by the imperial government. He did not make paganism illegal that would come later, under Theodosius, but he made the direction of travel unmistakable. Constantinople was, architecturally and strategically, one of the most significant decisions in Western history. Built on a peninsula at the meeting of Europe and Asia, controlling the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, it was militarily nearly impregnable and commercially positioned on the most important trade routes of the Eastern world. When the Western Empire faltered in the following century, Constantinople would survive and survive and survive for another 1,000 years as the capital of what we call the Byzantine Empire, maintaining a continuous thread of Roman governance and culture until 1453 CE, when the Ottoman Turks finally breached its walls. That is a remarkable footnote to what tonight's story is usually told as a tale of decline. The eastern half of Rome outlasted the western half by 1,000 years, functioning as a sophisticated urban civilization throughout the period that Western Europe spent in the reduced circumstances we call the Dark Ages. The Western Empire's final century, from roughly 375 to 476 CE, is less a dramatic collapse than a long, grinding process of political fragmentation, during which Roman administrative control was progressively replaced by the rule of Germanic kings who were, in many cases, genuinely attempting to preserve Roman civilization rather than destroy it. The Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410 CE under Alaric, the first time the city had been taken by an enemy in 800 years, spent 3 days in the city and left largely intact. They wanted to be paid, not to burn. Alaric had served as a Roman general. His people had been settled inside Roman territory as foederati, allied peoples given land in exchange for military service for decades. He was not an outsider attacking civilization. He was an insider who had concluded that the most efficient way to get what he was owed was to come and collect it in person. The date conventionally given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, whose name combined the founder of Rome with the founder of the empire in a coincidence that historians have found too neat to fully trust. Odoacer did not declare a new Germanic kingdom. He sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople and accepted the title of King of Italy under the nominal authority of the Eastern Emperor. He was, in his own self-understanding, not ending Rome but reorganizing its administration, which is, in a way, the final answer to the question. Rome did not fall. Rome dissolved. It dissolved so gradually that many people living through it did not recognize the process as dissolution at all. They recognized it as a series of individual crises, each managed with varying degrees of success, each leaving the system slightly less capable of managing the next one. The people who watched cattle graze in the Forum in 600 CE were not watching the aftermath of a dramatic defeat. They were watching the end point of 2 centuries of institutional erosion, so gradual that no single generation had witnessed enough of it to fully comprehend the arc. The people living in early medieval Rome, the 30,000 or so who remained from the million of the imperial peak, did not think of themselves as survivors of a collapse. They thought of themselves as Romans. They used Roman law, observed Roman religious festivals mixed with Christian ones. lived in Roman buildings, and drank water from aqueducts that Roman engineers had built 3 centuries earlier, and that, in some cases, still flowed. They spoke a language that was drifting from Latin into what would eventually become Italian, but which they experienced as simply the way one spoke. They were, in every way they could perceive, continuous with what had come before, which is perhaps the most unsettling part of the answer. Civilization does not always announce its own endings. Sometimes it just keeps going, diminished and repurposed, and stripped of its grandest ambitions, until what it has become is so different from what it was that the word fall finally becomes appropriate, long after the fall has actually occurred. Chapter 13. The World Rome Made. Legacy, Inheritance, and What We Still Carry. What survived Rome's dissolution was, in many respects, more durable than the legions or the aqueducts. Language survived. Latin did not die, it evolved. The Romance languages Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian are Latin, changed by time and geography and contact with other tongues into new forms, but recognizably descended from the tongue of Cicero and Caesar. English, which is a Germanic language at its structural core, carries somewhere between 30 and 60% of its vocabulary from Latin, either directly or through French. When a lawyer today speaks of habeas corpus, or a scientist of a biological genus, or a politician of a republic, they are speaking Latin. Law survived. The Roman legal tradition codified most completely under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE in the corpus known as the Justinian Code, became the foundational legal system of continental Europe and through European colonialism and influenced much of the world. The distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personhood, the presumption of innocence, the idea that law should be written down and publicly accessible, all of these are Roman inheritances that the legal systems of most modern states take for granted. Architecture survived not just in the ruins that dot the landscape from Britain to Iraq, but in the vocabulary of building that Roman engineers developed and that subsequent civilizations absorbed and adapted. The arch, the vault, the dome, the use of concrete as a structural medium, these did not die with the Western Empire. They were transmitted through Byzantine architecture, absorbed by Islamic architecture in Spain and the Middle East, revived in Renaissance Europe, and are in continuous use today. The Pantheon's dome principle lives in the United States Capitol building and in every domed structure you have seen from a car window. The concept of the week survived. The Romans did not invent the 7-day week, they borrowed it, ultimately from Babylonian astronomy, mediated through Jewish and Hellenistic practice, but they standardized it across the empire, named the days after the sun, the moon, and 5 known planets, and their version of those names is what most European languages still use. Saturday is Saturn's day. Sunday is the sun's day. Monday is the moon's day. You have been living in Roman time your entire life, and this is probably not something you think about on a Tuesday, which is Tuesday in Old English. But Tiu was the Germanic equivalent of Mars, so it is effectively Mars's day. The Romans are present in the calendar on your wall. The calendar, the legal vocabulary, the architectural forms, the Romance languages, the very idea of the state of a political entity larger than the family, the tribe, or the city, capable of providing law and infrastructure across an enormous territory, is, in the Western tradition, a Roman inheritance, even where it is most vigorously denied. And then there is the inheritance that came specifically through Rome's adoption of Christianity, an institution that would, in the medieval centuries, carry much of what was worth preserving from the classical world: the manuscripts in the monasteries, the architectural traditions in the churches, the legal thinking in the canon law across the gap between the ancient and the modern worlds. The Catholic Church maintained Latin as a liturgical and scholarly language for 15 centuries after the fall of the Western Empire, providing an intellectual thread connecting medieval scholars directly to their Roman predecessors. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, traces his institutional authority to the Apostle Peter, but his practical authority derives in no small part from the fact that Rome was, for centuries, the administrative center of the Western world, and the bishop who filled that seat absorbed some of the gravitational pull of the office regardless of its theological basis. There is something worth sitting with in all of this as the night deepens. The Romans would not have recognized themselves in what survived. A Roman senator of the 1st century BCE, transported forward to the medieval world, would have found the monasteries alien, the church's authority incomprehensible, the Latin spoken by medieval scholars barely recognizable, the cities diminished beyond his ability to process. He would not have felt that his civilization had continued. And yet, it had. In the only ways civilizations actually continue, not in the physical persistence of their buildings or the direct transmission of their institutions, but in the ideas and habits and assumptions that get passed from person to person, generation to generation, transformed in the passing but never entirely lost. The Roman Republic's principle that power should be checked and accountable sits inside every constitution that provides for separation of powers. The Roman aqueduct's principle that clean water should be delivered to the entire city sits inside every modern municipal water system. The Roman road network's principle that infrastructure is a public good that enables everything else sits inside the argument for every bridge and highway and fiber optic cable that your taxes have ever paid for. The traveler at the milestone. There is something in that image. Someone at a crossroads, resting, looking down the road ahead that feels right for where we are in tonight's journey. We have traveled a long way. We have come from a cluster of mud and wattle huts on a malaria-prone hilltop above a fordable river, through the kings and the Republic and the Punic Wars and the Gracchi and Caesar and Augustus and the good emperors and the crisis of the 3rd century and the dissolution and the transformation. We have met farmers and senators and enslaved people and soldiers and freed women and emperors who wept, and emperors who were terrible, and one emperor who wrote philosophy by lamplight in a military tent on the Danube, and who knew as clearly as anyone that what he was presiding over would not last. And yet, here we are in the 21st century, still debating in institutions that owe their form to Rome, still drinking from municipal water systems whose engineering principles descend in a direct line from the aqueducts, still using a calendar whose structure was fixed by Julius Caesar, still speaking languages that are Latin, wearing different clothes. The cattle that grazed in the Forum in 600 CE were not wrong about what had happened. The Forum was in ruins, the empire was gone, the institutions had failed, the million inhabitants had become 30,000. And yet, underground, the Cloaca Maxima still drained into the Tiber. The Pantheon's dome still stood. The legal traditions were being copied in the monasteries. The language was changing into something new. The Romans understood, better than most civilizations, that what they were building would outlast them. They built their roads and their aqueducts and their concrete domes with a deliberateness about permanence that is striking even now. They built to last, and in the ways that matter most, in the ideas, in the language, in the legal traditions, in the architectural vocabulary, in the very concept of what a city and a state and a civilization can be, they succeeded. What they could not control was what those who came after them would do with what they left behind. That is, perhaps, the only thing no civilization has ever been able to control. Chapter 14. The Roman woman. from property to power. 215 BCE. Rome is in the darkest period of the Second Punic War. Hannibal has destroyed 3 armies. The treasury is depleted. The Senate is debating how to pay for the next campaign. And in this crisis, the Roman women do something that the formal historical record almost fails to capture, but which the Oppian Law's repeal debate preserves in remarkable detail. The Oppian Law, passed in the emergency of 215 BCE, had restricted the amount of gold women could own, the colors they could wear, and the type of vehicle in which they could travel. It was a wartime austerity measure. 20 years later, with the war won and Rome prosperous again, proposals were made to repeal it. The conservative politician Cato the Elder, who had opinions about most things and shared them with approximately everyone who came within earshot, argued strenuously against repeal. He argued that women's luxury was dangerous to the state, that Roman women were getting ideas above their station, and that allowing them to own gold and wear colors was a slippery slope too, and he was genuinely this dramatic about it. The collapse of Roman male authority in the home. The women won. They organized. They gathered in public, which was itself highly irregular. They spoke to the tribunes and to male citizens in the streets, and the Oppian Law was repealed. The historian Livy, writing 2 centuries later, is clearly somewhat uncomfortable with the story. He records Cato's speech against repeal in enormous detail and rather less detail about the women's side of the argument, which is a characteristic archival imbalance. But he records the outcome, and the outcome is unambiguous. The Roman women organized a public political campaign, and they got what they wanted. This story tells us something important about the gap between Roman women's formal legal status and their actual social power, a gap that is one of the more interesting puzzles in Roman social history. In formal legal terms, the Roman woman was under the guardianship of a male relative, her father, her husband, or a male guardian appointed by will throughout much of the Republic. She could not hold public office. She could not vote. She could not serve in the army, though she could and did serve as military medics, camp followers, and, in at least documented cases in the later empire, as actual combatants in frontier emergencies. The formal constraints were real. And yet, Roman women of the patrician and equestrian classes routinely managed substantial property. They ran businesses. They funded political campaigns. They educated their children. They corresponded with the leading intellectuals of their day. Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, was one of the most admired figures of the late Republic, not for what her sons did, but for her own intellectual distinction. Her letters were still being read and quoted a century after her death. By the imperial period, the legal constraints on Roman women of the upper classes had been substantially relaxed through a series of legal fictions that the Romans, characteristically, developed without acknowledging they were changing anything fundamental. The tutela, the guardianship requirement, was retained in form but made practically meaningless. A woman who had borne 3 children was legally freed from it entirely. Women could and did own property, make wills, run businesses, and pursue legal cases in their own names. Several women of the imperial family wielded political influence that any honest account of the period is compelled to acknowledge. Livia, wife of Augustus, mother of Tiberius, was the most powerful woman in the Western world for more than 50 years, and she managed it with a political sophistication that would have been recognized and respected had she been a man. She outlived Augustus by 15 years, and spent much of that time managing her son Tiberius's relationship with the Senate with a directness that Tiberius found, depending on his mood, either useful or maddening. When she died at 87, Tiberius refused to attend her funeral, blocked her deification, and set about dismantling her political influence with the energy of a man who had been waiting decades for the opportunity. Which, to be fair, he may have been. The story of Roman women is not a simple story of oppression or of liberation. It is a story of the persistent gap between formal legal status and actual social power, a gap that many women negotiated with remarkable intelligence and effect. It is also a story of the women for whom no gap existed, the enslaved women who had no legal protections whatsoever, the urban poor women whose freedom was entirely theoretical, given the material constraints of their lives, the Vestal virgins who exchanged one form of constraint for another in a bargain that bought them remarkable influence, but at significant personal cost. The Roman woman's story, like most of Roman history, is not one story. It is several million stories, most of which we will never know. Chapter 15. Gods Everywhere. How Romans Actually Worshipped. Most people, asked to picture Roman religion, picture something grand. The Pantheon, the sacrifices, the great temple precincts, the elaborate ritual of the public priests. And all of that was real, and it mattered. But the religion that most Romans actually lived in was considerably more intimate. At the corner of nearly every Roman street, there was a competum, a small shrine to the Lares Compitales, the guardian spirits of the crossroads. In nearly every home, there was a lararium, a household shrine to the family's own lares and penates, the protective spirits of the hearth and storeroom. On every significant occasion, a birthday, a departure on a journey, a business success, a recovery from illness, Romans made offerings at these shrines as naturally as a modern person might knock on wood or check a horoscope. Not quite believing and not quite disbelieving, doing the thing because it has always been done and because the cost of not doing it seems higher than the cost of doing it. Roman religion was, by the standards of what was coming, extraordinarily accommodating. The Romans had a category for foreign gods, the Dei Peregrini, the foreign deities. And when they conquered a new people, the standard practice was not to suppress local religion, but to find the equivalences. Jupiter was Zeus. Juno was Hera. Mars was Ares. The Gaulish god Epona, goddess of horses and cavalry, was adopted wholesale into the Roman military religion and worshipped by cavalry units across the entire empire. The Egyptian Isis accumulated a following in Rome that extended across every social class. The Romans were, religiously speaking, enthusiastic borrowers. Their instinct for cultural absorption extended to the divine. The Roman religious calendar was dense with festivals, perhaps 100 days in the year, that involved some form of public religious observance. The Saturnalia in December, when social hierarchies were temporarily inverted and masters served their slaves at table, is the most famous, and has a ghost life in modern Christmas traditions that would have amused and possibly baffled the Romans who celebrated it. The Lupercalia in February involved priests running naked through the city streets, striking people with strips of goatskin, which was considered beneficial for fertility and was, by all accounts, extremely popular. The Romans were not a people who found religion a solemn and private affair. They liked it loud and public, and occasionally involving people running through the streets. The Saturnalia ran for 7 days. It involved gift-giving, feasting, gambling, and the suspension of formal social rules that Roman life otherwise enforced with some rigor. The slaves who received their master's service for those days were under no illusion that the reversal was permanent. The masters who performed it were under no illusion that they were endorsing social equality. The festival was a pressure valve, an acknowledgement, embedded in religious practice, that the tension created by the social hierarchy needed regular release if it was to remain stable the rest of the year. Whether this constitutes wisdom or cynicism is a question the Romans would have found interesting and slightly missing the point. The Romans read the future in bird flight, in animal entrails, in lightning, in the behavior of the sacred chickens that accompanied every Roman army on campaign. The sacred chickens were kept in cages and consulted before any major military engagement. Their appetite indicated divine favor or disfavor. The general Publius Claudius Pulcher, facing the Carthaginian fleet in 249 BCE, was informed that the chickens were not eating, indicating an unfavorable omen. His response was to throw the chickens overboard into the sea, remarking that if they would not eat, they could drink. He then engaged the Carthaginian fleet and suffered one of the most catastrophic naval defeats in Roman history. The Romans recorded this story not as an example of rational skepticism triumphing over superstition. They recorded it as an example of impiety getting exactly what it deserved. The chickens had been trying to help. The mystery religions, Mithraism, the cults of Isis and Osiris, the Eleusinian mysteries, and eventually Christianity filled a need that the civic religion of Jupiter and Juno did not address: the need for personal transformation. The public Roman religion was communal and contractual. You performed the rituals. You made the offerings. The gods were propitiated. The city was protected. It was a public transaction, not a private conversion. The mystery religions offered something different: initiation, secret knowledge, a community of the initiated, and the promise of a better fate after death than the gray, joyless underworld of traditional Roman belief. Christianity offered all of these things and added one more: the erasure of social distinction within the community. In the eyes of the Christian God, the slave and the senator were equal. This was, to the senatorial class, a deeply unsettling proposition. To the slave, the freedman, the urban poor, the woman of limited legal status, to the considerable majority of the Roman world who were not senatorial, it was rather the most interesting thing anyone had said about the divine since the Romans started listening. We will talk more about how Christianity changed Rome and how Rome changed Christianity as tonight's journey continues. But there is one more chapter in the daily life of the Roman world that deserves its own careful attention, perhaps the most consistently misunderstood aspect of Roman civilization, at least by those who have never had to wear 60 pounds of equipment for 20 miles. Chapter 16. Inside the Legion. The soldier's real life. So what was it actually like, being a Roman soldier? Not the battle parts, the battles have been covered. The actual daily texture of a life that most Roman legionaries spent the vast majority of in garrison duty, building projects, administrative work, and the kind of grinding routine that military service has always involved far more of than glory. A legionary signed up for a term of 25 years. 25 years. Those of you who served and know what 4 years felt like will take a moment with that number. 25 years, during which you were legally prohibited from marrying a rule that was widely evaded in practice and eventually abolished by Septimius Severus in the late 2nd century CE, but which remained nominal law for the first 2 centuries of the empire. You were paid a salary about 900 sestertii per year under Augustus, rising over time, from which the army deducted the cost of your food, your equipment, your burial club membership, and your share of the regimental savings fund. By the time the deductions were done, a legionary's disposable income was modest. The retirement package land or a cash payment after 25 years was the real compensation. The basic organizational unit of the Roman legion was the contubernium, 8 men who shared a tent on campaign and a barracks room in garrison. They cooked together, shared equipment, marched together, fought together, and in practice formed the primary social bond of a soldier's life. The century 80 men commanded by a centurion was the tactical and administrative unit. The cohort 6 centuries was the operational unit. The Legion 10 cohorts, roughly 5,000 men, was the strategic unit. It is a structure of elegant mathematical simplicity, and it had the virtue of being comprehensible at every level, from the individual soldier to the overall commander. The centurion was the backbone of the Roman military system. Not the generals, not the tribunes, not the legates, the centurion. He was the man who actually ran the century. He trained the men, enforced discipline, led from the front in combat, managed the administrative paperwork, knew every man's name and family situation, and was the primary point of contact between the institution and the individual. He was distinguished by his transverse crest on his helmet, his vine staff, the vitis, which he used both as a mark of office and, when necessary, as an instrument of on-the-spot correction. The Romans were not casual about corporal punishment. Roman legionary training was, by the standards of the ancient world, systematic and demanding. New recruits trained for 4 months before being considered combat-ready. The training regimen included long marches carrying the full kit 60 Roman pounds, which is approximately 17 kilograms, which is approximately what a modern infantry soldier carries, and which does not feel lighter because the Romans were doing it 2,000 years ago. They practiced weapons drill with wooden swords and shields made twice the weight of the real equipment, on the logic that if you can swing the heavy practice weapon correctly, the real weapon will feel like nothing. This is, incidentally, the same logic behind the weighted batting donuts baseball players use in the on-deck circle, which suggests that some training insights are fairly universal. The march itself was a defining feature of legionary life. 20 Roman miles per day was the standard pace, roughly 29 kilometers, carrying the full kit, in the summer heat of the Mediterranean or the winter cold of the Rhine frontier. A forced march could push that to 30 miles. The legion could sustain this for weeks, with rest days at intervals. When they stopped, they built a camp every night, a full marching camp with palisade and ditch, laid out to the same standard plan regardless of the terrain. On campaign, a Roman soldier spent more time digging than fighting. This is, again, a truth about military service that has not changed appreciably across the centuries. The surviving correspondence of Roman soldiers, preserved on wooden tablets, on papyrus scraps, occasionally on lead sheets, reveals a world of very ordinary human concerns beneath the military discipline. Soldiers wrote home asking for specific food items the army rations didn't include. They sent money to families, requested news of aging parents, complained about the weather with a precision and duration that suggests the instinct for weather commentary was not invented in the British Isles. One papyrus from Egypt, dated to the 2nd century CE, is a letter from a soldier named Apion to his father, written shortly after his arrival at his posting. He tells his father that he has arrived safely, that he has found good companions, that the god has preserved him on the journey. He asks his father to write back, to let him know the family is well. He closes with the hope that his father will receive his letter and know he is alive and prospering. 2,000 years. The letter could have been written last week, and later in tonight's journey, we will follow some of these soldiers to the frontiers that shaped them, to Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain, where a garrison of several thousand men from across the empire spent decades in a landscape they had never chosen and learned to call home. But first, we need to understand something that sits underneath everything we have discussed tonight: the money. Chapter 17. How the Roman economy actually worked. Misconception. The Romans were primarily a military civilization whose economy was organized around conquest. Correction? The Romans were primarily a commercial civilization whose military power was its most effective business tool. At the peak of the empire, the Mediterranean was essentially a Roman lake. its shores controlled, its sea lanes secured by the Roman navy, its ports connected by the road network, its commerce protected by Roman law and conducted in Roman currency. This was not an accident. It was a commercial infrastructure that made the Mediterranean basin the most economically integrated region the world had seen since, with the possible exception of certain sophisticated trade networks in Asia, and that would not be matched again in the Western world until considerably later than the Romans would have found flattering. Rome's grain supply alone was an operation of staggering scale. The city of 1 million required roughly 270,000 tons of grain per year. This grain came primarily from Egypt and North Africa, the breadbaskets of the ancient world carried by a fleet of grain ships, whose regular arrival at Ostia was one of the most important logistical events in the Roman calendar. The grain was stored in the Horea, the state warehouses distributed through a network of neighborhood distribution points, and provided to the registered poor of the city through the annona, the grain dole, at subsidized or free prices. Managing the grain supply was a senior government appointment, the praefectus annoni, comparable in importance and complexity to any modern cabinet position. When the grain supply was disrupted by storm or by crop failure or by political interference in the supply chain, the social consequences were felt within days. Roman urban crowds were not patient about their bread. Beyond grain, the Roman economy traded in remarkable volume and variety. Spanish olive oil, Gallic pottery, British tin and lead, Syrian purple dye, Egyptian papyrus, Arabian spices, Chinese silk arriving via the Parthian, and Silk Road networks at prices that made it a luxury only the most wealthy could afford. Black pepper, which grows in India, was sufficiently valuable in Rome that Alaric's ransom demand in 410 CE included 3,000 pounds of it alongside the gold and silver. A spice you can buy in any supermarket for a few coins was, in Rome, a currency of ransom. The Roman economy was, in modern economic terms, a pre-industrial market economy of considerable sophistication. It had banks, the argentarii, who accepted deposits, made loans, handled currency exchange, and issued letters of credit that could be redeemed at branches in other cities, a function not unlike what a modern bank does with correspondent banking. It had insurance maritime loan contracts that were repaid only if the ship arrived safely, a structure economically equivalent to insurance. It had joint stock enterprises societates in which multiple investors contributed capital to shared commercial ventures, from tax farming contracts to mining operations to trading partnerships. What the Roman economy lacked, what kept it from achieving a genuine industrial revolution of the kind that would occur in Britain 18 centuries later, is one of the more interesting questions in economic history. The Romans had water mills. They had sophisticated metallurgy. They had advanced agricultural techniques. They had the organizational capacity to run an empire of 70 million people. They also had, and this is the part that matters, enormous quantities of enslaved labor, which made mechanical innovation economically unnecessary. If you can compel a human being to do the work for the cost of feeding and housing them, there is no commercial incentive to develop a machine to replace them. The economic logic of slavery, extended across centuries, may have been the single most significant break on Roman technological development, a thought that the Romans themselves never articulated and might have found perplexing, but which the economic historians of the modern era find increasingly hard to avoid. The Roman economy at its height was genuinely impressive by the standards of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence, the distribution of Roman amphorae across Europe and beyond, the chemical fingerprinting of lead in Greenland ice cores that shows a measurable Roman economic signal in global lead deposits suggests a level of economic integration and commercial activity that would not be surpassed in Europe until roughly the 16th century CE. That particular detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The Roman economic peak left a measurable signal in Greenland's ice. The Roman commercial collapse, when it came in the 3rd and 4th centuries, is visible in the same ice cores as an abrupt reduction in atmospheric lead, a proxy for economic activity. It took until the High Middle Ages to recover. We can see Rome's economic trajectory written in the ice of the Arctic. That is, by any measure, rather extraordinary. Those who spent careers in industry or commerce, who understand supply chains and currency stability, and the compounding effects of institutional erosion on economic confidence, may find the Roman economic story the most immediately legible part of tonight's journey. If you have thoughts on the parallels, the comments section below is genuinely the right place for them. This audience's perspective on what economic systems can and cannot sustain is not something you find in the academic literature. We have spent tonight moving through Roman history at the altitude of the eagle, surveying centuries from above, tracing the broad arcs of political and military and economic change. But there is a version of Roman history that operates at a different altitude entirely. The level of the street, the neighborhood, the individual face in the crowd. In the next part of tonight's journey, we will descend to that street level. We will walk through the neighborhoods of Pompeii, frozen in the summer of 79 CE by the eruption of Vesuvius, the most complete snapshot of Roman daily life that history has preserved, and we will meet the people who lived there. The baker who left his bread in the oven when the ash began to fall. The woman whose jewelry was found with her bones at the shore, where she had run for safety. The school children whose teachers had written exercises on the walls. The gladiator whose helmet was found in a patrician bedroom, which raises a question that historians have been carefully not specifying the answer to for several centuries. We will walk those streets, and in walking them, we will find the human scale of everything we have been discussing tonight. The Roman world, for all its enormity, was made of individual lives. It always is. Chapter 18. Pompeii, a city frozen in time. August 24th, 79 CE, or possibly October 23rd. The precise date remains under scholarly debate, which is the kind of detail that Pompeii keeps offering to remind us that even the most thoroughly studied site in the ancient world still holds questions. In any case, a morning that began in the most ordinary possible way. The baker at the bakery of Modestus had set his bread in the oven. He had 81 loaves ready for the second baking of the day. Archaeologists found them there, carbonized but perfectly preserved in shape, when they excavated the site in the 19th century, still in the oven, still in their individual portions, stamped with the bakery's mark. The baker left in a hurry. He did not take his bread. Vesuvius had been showing signs for days: minor earth tremors, unusual sulfurous smells, the springs in the surrounding farmland going dry. The Romans did not recognize these as volcanic warning signs, because nobody in the recorded history of the region had seen Vesuvius erupt within living memory. It looked like a mountain. Mountains do not explode, except occasionally they do. The eruption began mid-morning on that late summer day. The initial column of ash and gas rose approximately 33 kilometers into the atmosphere, higher than modern commercial aircraft cruise altitude, and collapsed in the afternoon into the pyroclastic surges and flows that killed the majority of Pompeii's population. Death in the surges was almost instantaneous, a superheated cloud of gas and ash moving at hurricane speeds, reaching temperatures of up to 300 degrees Celsius. The people found in the positions of sleep, of conversation, of running, the famous plaster casts made from the voids their bodies left in the hardened ash died so quickly that the position in which they were caught is the position in which they died. The younger Pliny, who watched the eruption from Misenum 29 kilometers away, where he was staying with his uncle Pliny. The elder wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing what he saw. They are among the most extraordinary documents in ancient literature, precise, observational, almost journalistic in their attention to physical detail, and simultaneously deeply human in their account of a young man watching the world end while trying to remain calm for his mother's sake. Pliny the Elder, the great naturalist, the author of the encyclopedic natural history, sailed toward the eruption rather than away from it, partly to rescue friends and partly, one suspects, because he was constitutionally incapable of not examining a natural phenomenon at close range. He died on the beach at Stabiae, almost certainly from the volcanic gases. His nephew survived. His letters survived. The account of what Vesuvius did on that late summer day is, partly because of those letters, the most completely documented natural disaster in ancient history. What Vesuvius destroyed it also preserved. The ash and pumice that killed Pompeii's remaining population sealed the city under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material, and, in that sealed condition, preserved it with a fidelity that no other ancient site can match. When excavations began in earnest in the 18th century, archaeologists found a city that had been frozen mid-sentence. The election campaign notices on the walls, painted perhaps weeks before the eruption, were still legible. The graffiti in Pompeii has extraordinary quantities of graffiti recorded, jokes, insults, love declarations, philosophical observations, business advertisements, and at least one piece of literary criticism that suggests Roman graffiti writers had opinions about Virgil that they were not shy about sharing on public walls. The graffiti of Pompeii is one of the most intimate documents the ancient world has left us, precisely because it was never intended as a document at all. It is what people wrote when they thought no one was keeping records. Someone wrote in Latin that they are amazed the wall has not yet collapsed under the weight of so much writing. Someone else wrote the opening lines of Virgil's Aeneid on a tavern wall, and then stopped halfway through the second line, apparently losing interest or running out of wall. A gladiator named Celidus was described as the heartthrob and sigh of the girls by what appears to be his own hand. The Romans, 2,000 years ago, left reviews of each other in permanent form on public walls. The instinct, apparently, is ancient. Pompeii had a population of approximately 11,000 people at the time of the eruption. The Forum, the amphitheater, the large and small theaters, the public baths plural, at least 4 sets, the temples, the gymnasium, the brothels, the fulleries where wool was washed and processed in large vats of, one would prefer not to know but must acknowledge, human urine collected from public street containers for its ammonia content. The Romans washed their wool in human urine. The wool was apparently excellent. Let's agree to leave that particular production process in the ancient world where it belongs and move on with gratitude for industrial chemistry. The House of the Faun was one of Pompeii's grandest private residences, spanning an entire city block, containing some of the finest mosaic work in the ancient world, including the great Alexander mosaic depicting the Battle of Issus, which was almost certainly a copy of an earlier Greek painting and is still regarded as one of the masterpieces of ancient art. The house belonged, scholars believe, to the family of Publius Sulla, who was connected by family ties to the dictator Sulla. The bronze dancing faun that gives the house its modern name stood in the impluvium pool of the first atrium, a small exuberant figure caught mid-dance, approximately 63 centimeters tall, whose expression of unself-conscious delight is about as far from the grave Roman stereotype as it is possible to get. One of the most poignant stories Pompeii tells is not from the grand houses, but from the ordinary ones. in the house of the gold bracelet named for jewelry found there, archaeologists found the remains of a family in the garden, 2 adults, 2 children, and a woman whose jewelry suggests she was of some prosperity. The jewelry she was wearing when she died includes a snake bracelet of solid gold, earrings, 2 rings. She had taken the time to put on her best things before she ran. Or perhaps she always wore them. We cannot know. But the image of a woman putting on her gold bracelet while Vesuvius rained death from the sky, or simply wearing her good jewelry on a morning that began normally, is the kind of human detail that makes 2,000 years collapse into nothing. The gladiatorial barracks near the large theater contained the equipment and remains of several gladiators when it was excavated. Standard enough until archaeologists also found, in a room that had clearly been furnished to a considerably higher standard than the standard gladiatorial cell, the skeleton of a woman wearing gold jewelry. Who she was, what she was doing in the gladiatorial barracks, and how she feels about being part of this particular historical footnote are questions that Pompeii has declined to answer with any specificity. Historians, with the tactful discretion of people who have learned to let some things rest, describe her as a visitor of uncertain purpose. Pompeii is, at its core, an argument against abstraction. Every time the Roman world threatens to become a series of dates and political movements and military campaigns, Pompeii pulls it back to the specific. The bread in the oven, the snake bracelet, the joke on the wall, the person who ran toward the sea and didn't make it. History is people. It is always people. The dates and the battles and the institutional developments are the skeleton. The people are everything else, the muscle and the nerve and the voice. And Pompeii, more than anywhere else in the Roman world, gives us the voice. Chapter 19. Hadrian's Wall, the Empire's Edge. In 122 CE, the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain, one of the few reigning emperors to actually visit the province, and ordered the construction of a wall across the island's narrowest point, from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east. 73 miles of stone and turf construction, completed in roughly 6 years, garrisoned by an eventual force of approximately 9,000 to 10,000 soldiers drawn from across the empire. Not the legions, the frontier auxiliaries. The men on Hadrian's Wall were not Roman citizens in the traditional sense, or rather, many of them began as non-citizens who earned citizenship through their military service. They were Batavians from the Rhine Delta, Tungrians from modern Belgium, Gauls, Dacians, Sarmatian cavalry from the Russian steppe, Hamian archers from Syria, who were almost certainly the most comprehensively miserable soldiers in the history of the wall, because a unit trained for desert warfare in the heat of Syria and deployed to the north of England in November is experiencing something the Romans would have called, with considerable diplomatic understatement, a reassignment. The Vindolanda tablets are the most intimate surviving document of life on the Roman frontier. Thin slices of wood, approximately postcard-sized, written on in ink with reed pens, preserved in the oxygen-free conditions of the waterlogged soil at Vindolanda Fort just south of the wall. They include military reports, supply requisitions, personal correspondence, duty rosters, and one letter that has become, in certain circles, very well known indeed. It is an invitation from the wife of one fort commander to the wife of another, written around 100 CE, inviting her to a birthday party. Her name was Claudia Severa. The guest of honor was her friend Sulpicia Lepidina. Claudia Severa writes, in the hand of a scribe, the formal invitation, and then, in her own handwriting at the bottom, adds a personal line. She hopes very much that Sulpicia Lepidina will come. She calls her her dearest soul. 2 women on the northern edge of the Roman Empire, separated by a few miles of frontier road, being friends in the year 100 of the Common Era, in the same way that women have been friends across every century before and since. It is, in its way, the most Roman thing in this entire script. What the Vindolanda tablets reveal collectively is that life on the frontier was simultaneously more organized and more human than the military histories suggest. The supply requisitions list what the garrison at Vindolanda was eating and using: Celtic beer, rather than the Mediterranean wine that soldiers stationed in warmer provinces preferred, large quantities of wheel-ground grain, hunting nets, and leather tent panels and axle grease, medicinal plants, shoe repairs. The constant mundane logistics of keeping several hundred men alive and functional in northern England in the 2nd century, or E. A soldier named Masculus, serving in a unit at one of the wall forts, sent a letter to his commanding officer that has survived in the Vindolanda archive. He writes with the practiced deference of a subordinate addressing his superior, but his need is urgent. His men have no beer. He asks politely, carefully, but with the unmistakable undertone of a man who knows how soldiers behave, when the beer situation is not resolved, whether the commanding officer might arrange a resupply. The beer situation, from the framing of the request, has been ongoing for some time. Whether it was resolved, the historical record does not specify. We hope it was. The men of Hadrian's Wall, after their 25 years of service, those who survived were often granted land in the province where they had served, rather than the distant homeland they had left as young men. Many of them stayed. Their children, of mixed Roman-British or Roman-Gallic or Roman-Batavian ancestry, speaking a form of Latin mixed with local languages, became the local population. The wall garrison's DNA is literally present in the modern population of northern England. When people in Northumberland today have surnames that show up in surprising locations across Europe, they are sometimes, in the most direct biological sense, the descendants of the men who stood on that wall in the northern cold, watching the empty moorland to the north, and wondering why on earth the empire needed it to extend this far. Chapter 20. Roman Medicine. What they knew and what they didn't. The Romans were, by the standards of the ancient world, unusually systematic about medicine, not because they had particularly accurate theories about how the body worked, but because they were good at observation, record-keeping, and the organizational application of whatever knowledge they possessed. Their theoretical framework was inherited from the Greeks, specifically from the Hippocratic tradition, and was based on the doctrine of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose proper balance constituted health and whose imbalance constituted disease. This framework was wrong in essentially every particular, but it had the virtue of being internally consistent and of providing a rational basis for treatment, which, even when the treatment itself was ineffective, was considerably better than no framework at all. What Roman medicine got right, it got substantially right. Wound care in the military medical system was sophisticated. The Roman valetudinarium, the military hospital, was a purpose-built institution with separate wards for different types of injury. Good ventilation, fresh water supply, and a staff of trained medics who understood wound cleaning, suturing, and the management of infection far better than any pre-Listerian 19th century surgeon would have been comfortable admitting. Roman surgical instruments recovered from archaeological sites are, in many cases, functionally identical to instruments used in European surgery as late as the 18th century. Galen of Pergamon, the physician whose work dominated Western medicine from the 2nd century CE until the Renaissance, was a Roman citizen who served as physician to Marcus Aurelius's gladiatorial school before becoming the imperial physician. He wrote approximately 3 million words of medical text, much of which survived through Arabic translation, when the Latin originals were lost in the Western medieval collapse. He performed careful anatomical dissections, primarily of animals. since Roman law and custom made human dissection problematic, a limitation that left significant errors in his human anatomy. His cardiovascular physiology was substantially wrong. His understanding of the nervous system was impressive. His pharmaceutical knowledge, derived from careful observation of what actually worked rather than pure theory, was considerable. The Romans also produced Dioscorides, whose work on medicinal plants, the De Materia Medica, written in the 1st century CE, described approximately 600 plants and their therapeutic applications with a precision that made it the standard pharmacological reference in Europe and the Islamic world for over 1,000 years. Roughly a third of the plants he described are still used in modern medicine in some form, which means that a Roman physician's herbal compendium from the 1st century CE remains, in a very real sense, a partially valid pharmaceutical reference. What Roman medicine could not do, what no pre-modern medicine could do, was address infectious disease in any fundamental way. The great plagues that struck Rome in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE were entirely beyond the capacity of the medical system to control. Galen, who lived through the Antonine Plague and wrote about it extensively, could observe its progression, could document its symptoms, could offer supportive care to his patients, and could do nothing whatsoever to stop it. This is not a criticism of Roman medicine. It is simply the condition of medical knowledge before germ theory, before the development of antibiotics, before the understanding of immune function. The Roman physicians were not less intelligent than modern ones. They were working with less information. In a younger science, in a world where the fundamental mechanisms of infectious disease were as invisible and incomprehensible as the far side of the moon. They did the best that was possible with what could be known at the time. It is the only standard by which any generation can be judged. Chapter 21. Engineering beyond the roads, mines, mills, and the mechanics of an empire. The Roman mining operations in Spain, particularly at Rio Tinto and at Las Medulas, were among the largest industrial operations in the ancient world, and they were powered almost entirely by enslaved labor under conditions that the ancient sources themselves describe as extraordinarily brutal. Las Medulas, in the mountains of northwestern Spain, was a gold extraction site where the Romans applied a technique called ruina montium, the ruin of mountains, which involved driving horizontal tunnels into the hillside, filling them with water under pressure, and then releasing the water suddenly to collapse the hillside from the inside, after which the gold-bearing soil was washed and processed. The result was a landscape of extraordinary, alien beauty, terracotta spires, and eroded pillars created by 2 centuries of Roman hydraulic mining. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site because the Romans so thoroughly transformed the landscape that what they left behind is itself considered a cultural monument. The Romans also engineered on a more intimate scale the domestic and municipal engineering that made urban life possible. Underfloor heating, for instance, the hypocaust, the system of hollow floors and wall channels through which hot air was circulated from a furnace, was a Roman invention that heated not only the wealthy private homes we typically imagine, but also the public bathhouses that served the general population. The principle is essentially the same as modern radiant floor heating, developed in a pre-industrial context and never requiring a component more complex than fired clay and hollow space. The Romans built cranes, not metaphorically actual cranes, treadmill-powered hoisting devices documented both in archaeological remains and in a remarkable sculptural relief on the tomb of the Hadrian in Rome that shows one in operation. A treadmill crane works on the principle that a man walking inside a large wheel, turning it with his feet, can raise weights many times his own body mass through a system of pulleys. The Romans used these to lift the enormous stone blocks of their public buildings, the drum sections of columns, the voussoirs of arches, to heights that would otherwise have been impossible to reach. They also used a form of cement that set underwater an achievement that modern materials scientists have studied with considerable interest, because the specific combination of volcanic ash, seawater, and lime that the Romans used in their marine concrete actually strengthens over time as the seawater reacts with the volcanic material, producing a crystalline structure that modern synthetic concrete cannot match. We have been trying to replicate it for decades. The Roman achievement in engineering was not primarily a matter of discovering new principles. It was a matter of systematic application. The arch was not a Roman invention. The Egyptians and the Etruscans had used it. The vault was not Roman. The dome was not Roman. What the Romans did was take these principles, understand them well enough to apply them at scales and in combinations that nobody had previously attempted, and back that understanding with the organizational and logistical capacity of a state that could deploy thousands of skilled workers on a single project and sustain that deployment for years. They were, in the deepest sense, an engineering civilization. They thought in terms of systems: the road network as a system, the water supply as a system, the frontier defense as a system, the army as a system, the legal code as a system. The instinct that produced the aqueduct also produced the digest of Justinian. The same mind that calculated the gradient of a water channel also calculated the institutional relationships between the consuls and the Senate. Systems thinking, applied with Roman thoroughness across every domain of human endeavor, is perhaps the most accurate single characterization of what made Rome remarkable. There is something deeply satisfying and perhaps slightly humbling about the realization that the people who built Hadrian's Wall and the Pantheon and the aqueducts and the road network were not people of greater natural intelligence or greater innate capacity than the people who came before them or the people who came after. They were people who had developed good systems and who applied those systems with persistence and organizational scale. The genius was institutional as much as individual, which means, and the Romans would have appreciated the implication, that the same capacity is available to any civilization that is willing to do the organizational and intellectual work required to develop it. And that the surveyor with his groma at the edge of the known world, sighting his perfectly straight line into the uncertain landscape, beginning the work of making it, Roman is perhaps as good an image as any for where we are now in tonight's journey. We have surveyed the whole of it, from the village on the Palatine to the forum full of cattle, from Romulus throwing the sacred chickens into the Tiber to Marcus Aurelius writing philosophy in a frozen military tent, from the bread in the oven at Pompeii to the birthday invitation on the wooden tablet at Vindolanda, from the grain ships arriving at Ostia to the ice cores in Greenland that register their absence. We have one chapter left to walk together, the chapter where we slow all the way down and look at the human face of it, not the system, not the institution, not the arc of history, but the individual person at the center of their own unrepeatable life, in the greatest and most complicated civilization the ancient world produced. And then we rest. Chapter 22. Individual Lives, Portraits of the Ordinary Roman. His name, as best we can reconstruct it, was something like Gaius. Not a senator, not a general, not a man whose name attached itself to any battle or law or building that survived him. He was a baker in the Subura district of Rome, probably in the 1st century CE, when the empire was at its most stable and most prosperous. He rose before dawn, an hour at which the Subura's nighttime commercial traffic was still rattling over the stone paving outside his window, and went to his shop, where he loaded his stone oven with wood and set the first bread of the day to rise. He ground his grain the evening before which was when the donkey could be heard working the millstone, which was almost certainly a topic of conversation among his neighbors in the apartments above. He probably had a wife who managed the household accounts. The Romans were consistent about this, and the archaeological evidence from bakery contexts repeatedly shows women's names in the business records, not as assistants, but as co-proprietors and financial managers. He almost certainly had children, one or two of whom he hoped would take over the bakery, since a trained baker with an established clientele and a working oven was a considerable asset to pass on. He probably had a freedman assistant who slept in the shop and whose legal freedom had come at the price of continued labor obligations that differed from slavery primarily in their terminability. He probably had opinions about the grain dole, which affected his prices, and about the current political situation, which affected everything else, and about the neighbors upstairs, whose nocturnal habits were everyone's business in an insula where the walls were the thickness of a single brick. His name is lost. Her name is lost. The children's names are lost. The address of the bakery, some street in the Subura, which was the most densely populated and liveliest and least respectable district of Rome, situated between the Esquiline and Quirinal hills in a valley that flooded regularly and smelled accordingly, is lost. But the bread is not entirely lost, because the chemical analysis of carbonized bread from Roman sites has told us what grain varieties they used, how they prepared the dough, what additives they incorporated for texture and keeping quality. The biology of what this baker baked is partially recoverable, even when his name is not. This is what history does with ordinary people. It loses the name and keeps the bread. Let us speak briefly of a woman named Eumachia. She was a priestess of Venus in Pompeii, the daughter of a successful brick manufacturer, and the wife, later the widow of a prosperous man. In the early 1st century CE, she funded and dedicated the construction of one of the largest buildings in the Pompeii Forum, the building that bears her name, the Building of Eumachia, which was apparently associated with the Fullers Guild of the city and which represents a donation of private wealth to the city's public infrastructure on a scale that few male citizens of equivalent wealth attempted. The Fullers responded by erecting a statue of her in her own building, with an inscription honoring her. The statue was found in the building during excavations. The inscription uses the standard honorific language of the period, the language used for men of civic distinction, applied without modification to a woman who had earned it. Eumachia was not exceptional because she was a woman who wielded economic and civic influence in a Roman town. She was exceptional because her name and her story survived the ash of Vesuvius and the following 2,000 years. The Roman world contained thousands of women of equivalent substance and agency whose names did not survive, whose inscriptions eroded, whose statues were melted down, whose buildings were cannibalized for later construction. The names we have are a fraction of the names that existed, which are themselves a fraction of the lives that were lived. Consider the potter in a Gaulish workshop in the 2nd century CE, producing Samian ware, the fine red gloss pottery that was the mass-market tableware of the Roman Empire, found in excavations from Scotland to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. He was a craftsman in a production facility that employed dozens, manufacturing a product so standardized and so widely distributed that archaeologists use its presence as a proxy for Roman economic integration. Where you find Samian ware, you find Rome. He did not think of himself as a proxy for economic integration. He thought of himself as a potter, working the clay, tending the kiln, meeting the output targets that his employer or his own business required. He had a technique that took years to learn. He had preferences about clay composition and kiln temperature that he had developed through experience, and that lived in his hands as much as his head. when he stamped his maker's mark into the base of a pot, as many Samian ware potters did, the abbreviated signature that allowed proud or dissatisfied customers to know whose work they were using, he was doing something that craftsmen and women across all of human history have done. Asserting that this particular object, made by these particular hands, is worth acknowledging as an individual's work rather than an anonymous product. We have found thousands of these stamps. We have reconstructed the distribution networks of individual potters' workshops from the distribution of their stamps across the empire. We know which potters were most successful, which workshops expanded, which declined. We know from the stamps alone more about the commercial careers of these Gaulish potters than we know about the lives of most of the soldiers who used their products. The Roman tavern, the kaupona, was a social institution whose equivalent has existed in every human culture since the invention of fermented beverages, which is approximately as long as there have been human cultures worth discussing. The Roman version had wine from Spain and Gaul and the Eastern Mediterranean, heated in cold weather, sometimes mixed with honey or spices to make a product that the more particular modern palate might find challenging. It had food, simple food, the same thermopolium model as the street counters, nothing elaborate. It had dice games of a variety and complexity that Roman law intermittently tried to restrict and Roman citizens consistently ignored. It had conversation, argument, gossip, business deals, romantic encounters, and the occasional violent disagreement settled in the street outside, with a vigor that the city's vigils, the night watch, took a relaxed view of unless somebody actually died. The graffiti in the taverns of Pompeii and Herculaneum preserve voices that no official record was ever intended to capture. A tavern keeper's account scratched on a wall. On the 16th of November, for bread, 8 asses, for wine, 2 asses, for the slave girl, 8 asses. A guest's complaint, "We too, dear men, have wet the bed. I confess, innkeeper, we have sinned. If you want to know why, there was no chamber pot." The innkeeper who scratched the account and the guest who scratched the complaint are more present in those fragments than in any official history. Roman education, for those families who could access it, began around age 6 or 7 with the literator, the elementary teacher who taught reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. This school was usually held in a rented portico or public space, sometimes literally on a street corner behind a leather curtain, and the noise of the street was a constant feature of the Roman classroom experience that teachers complained about, with a persistence that suggests the problem was never adequately solved. Around age 11 or 12, those children whose families could afford it progressed to the grammaticus, the secondary teacher who taught literature, Greek, history, and rhetoric through the analysis of texts, primarily Homer and Virgil. The wealthiest went on to a rhetor for higher education in public speaking and argument. The Roman educational system was explicitly vocational at its highest level. The ability to speak effectively in public, to argue a case in court, to persuade an assembly, was the primary currency of Roman political and legal life, and the rhetor's training was preparation for exactly those performances. The Romans took death seriously enough to make it public. The funeral procession moved through the city streets, and the citizens were expected to stop and pay their respects, which served both the social function of honoring the dead and the political function for the families of the important dead of demonstrating the extent of one's social connections one final time. The imagines the wax portrait masks of distinguished ancestors were worn by actors in the procession, creating the impression that the dead were accompanied to the grave by all those who had preceded them. Death for the Romans was not a private matter conducted behind closed doors. It was a civic performance, a last opportunity to establish in public record who this person had been and who mourned them. The Romans buried their dead outside the city walls. The 12 tables had required this, since the 5th century BCE, which created the characteristic Roman roadside necropolis, the city of the dead lining the approaches to the city of the living. The tombs along the Via Appia south of Rome range from the monumentally ambitious multi-story mausolea, designed to be seen from a considerable distance, to the modest collective tombs of freed people's burial clubs, who pooled their resources to ensure that no member of the collegium would go to the grave without a memorial inscription recording their name and their freedom. The inscription on the simplest of these tombs, the ones that mark the burial of a freedman or freedwoman who scraped together the burial club fees for decades to ensure they would be remembered, tends to follow a formula. The name, the status libertus, liberta, freed, the years of life. Sometimes the name of the person who erected the stone, which was often a spouse or a child, and which is sometimes itself the most moving part of the inscription, because it tells you that this person, whatever their legal history, was loved. Dis manibus, to the divine shades, the opening of nearly every Roman funerary inscription. To the divine shades, who were the spirits of the dead in the Roman religious imagination, neither the gleaming immortals of the Greek tradition nor the personal heaven of the Christian one, but something quieter and more uncertain. The shades, the presences that remained when the person was gone. What is remarkable about the Roman world, looked at from sufficient distance, is not its palaces, or its legions, or its roads. Those are the furniture. What is remarkable is the sheer density of human life that it contained, the baker and the fuller and the potter and the tavern keeper and the soldier writing home from the wall, and the woman putting on her gold bracelet as the ash began to fall. The million individual lives that the system both enabled and constrained, that the institutions both protected and exploited, that the empire simultaneously made possible and made difficult in different ways for different people. History, at its most honest, is the attempt to remember as many of those lives as possible. It fails, inevitably. The record is fragmentary, the voices are mostly lost, the names erode from the stone. But the attempt itself, the insistence that the baker and the potter matter as much as the emperor, that the inscription on the modest stele along the Appian Way is as worthy of attention as the inscription on the Arch of Titus, is the best that history can offer. Chapter 23. The Roman Mirror, What We Still Are. There is a building in Rome, the Pantheon, that has been in continuous use since it was rebuilt by Hadrian around 125 CE, not restored and opened occasionally, continuously, without interruption, for 19 centuries. It survived the fall of the Western Empire, survived the medieval period, survived the Renaissance, survived the Industrial Revolution, survived 2 world wars. It stands today in the Piazza della Rotonda, in the Centro Storico of Rome, surrounded by tourists and pigeons and gelato vendors, still with its oculus open to the sky, still admitting the rain when the sky delivers it, still with its drain at the center of its slightly concave floor. The Romans who built it, the priests who tended it as a pagan temple, the Pope who reconsecrated it as a Christian church in 609 CE, the Renaissance artists who were buried in it, the tourists who walk through it today, all of them have stood under the same dome, looked up through the same oculus, watched the same shaft of sunlight track across the same floor, on the same days of the same months of the same years, because the oculus is fixed, and the earth still turns on its axis in the same direction it did when Hadrian consecrated the building. The Roman inheritance is not something we choose to accept or reject. It is simply present, woven into the fabric of how Western civilization thinks about law, governance, engineering, language, and the organization of time and space. When a senator stands to speak, she stands in a tradition that runs through every legislative chamber that took Rome as its model. which is most of them. When a student argues a case in a law school moot court, she is practicing a form of advocacy whose techniques were codified by Roman rhetoricians. When a city council debates the maintenance of public water infrastructure, they are having a conversation whose fundamental terms were established by the Romans, who understood that clean water was a public good and not a private commodity. These are not romantic exaggerations. They are the mundane, persistent, unkillable reality of the Roman legacy. What the monks in those cold medieval scriptoria were copying Roman law, Roman agricultural science, Roman medical knowledge, Roman philosophy, Roman poetry, was not, from their perspective, ancient history. It was the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had recently been their civilization, that was still, in some functional sense, their civilization's immediate predecessor, whose language they spoke in modified form, whose administrative structures they partially preserved, whose cities they still inhabited even in their diminished state. They were not archaeologists recovering a dead culture. They were librarians preserving a living one that had gone through a very bad century and needed its books kept safe. The transmission was imperfect. Much was lost. The works of Roman authors we know existed because other Romans quoted them: Ennius, Naevius, Lucilius, Varro's 940 books. Most of the Republican historians are gone, recoverable only in fragments, if at all. What survived is a selection, partly random, partly the result of deliberate medieval copying choices that favored certain authors and certain subjects over others. Virgil survived completely. Ovid survived almost completely. Livy survived partially. Dozens of other historians and poets and philosophers survived only in quotations embedded in the works of those who did survive. The Renaissance, the explosion of art, philosophy, science, and political thought in 14th through 16th century Europe was, in substantial part, Rome's return. The recovery of Roman texts through Byzantine sources, the archaeological excavation of Roman buildings and sculptures in Italy, the self-conscious attempt of Italian city-states to position themselves as successors to the Roman Republic. All of these made Renaissance European thought deeply, explicitly Roman in its reference points. The founding fathers of the United States read Polybius and Cicero and Livy as primary texts, not as historical curiosities. The Senate of the United States was named for the Roman Senate. The concept of the Republic Res Publica, the public thing that they were attempting to instantiate, was a Roman concept worked through centuries of subsequent political thought. This is not a simple inheritance. Rome was also the model for conquest, for empire, for the use of law as an instrument of dominion rather than protection. Every civilization that looked to Rome for inspiration found exactly what it was looking for, which tells you less about Rome than about the civilization doing the looking. Rome contained enough, was large enough, complex enough, contradictory enough to serve as a mirror for almost any political project, which is both its greatest gift to subsequent history and its most dangerous quality. The public library, that institution so Roman in its form, so present in modern life, was a Roman invention in the Western tradition. Julius Caesar planned one. Augustus's general Gaius Asinius Pollio built the first public library in Rome in 39 BCE. The libraries of Trajan's Forum held perhaps 20,000 scrolls accessible to any citizen who wished to read. The concept that knowledge, preserved in texts, should be a public resource accessible to all citizens regardless of their ability to pay for private copies, that is a Roman idea, and it runs in direct institutional descent to the public library in your town. When you use that library, if you are among the many watching tonight who grew up in a time when the public library was a genuine cultural institution, a place of learning and quiet, and the specific smell of old books, you are using something the Romans built. Not the building, the idea, the insistence that the accumulated knowledge of civilization belongs to the citizens. That idea has a Roman name, Res Publica. Chapter 24. The Long Rest, a conclusion. We have traveled a very long way tonight. From the mud-and-thatch village on the Palatine in 753 BCE to the forum full of cattle in 600 CE. 12 centuries of a civilization that was, at its greatest extent, the most powerful and most sophisticated the Western world had produced, and which ended not with a bang, as empires prefer to end in the stories they tell about themselves, but with a long, gradual thinning. A dissolution more than a collapse. A forgetting more than a defeat. We have met the baker who left his bread in the oven when the ash fell. We have met the soldier who needed beer on Hadrian's wall. We have met the woman who put on her gold bracelet and ran toward the sea. We have met the potter who stamped his mark into 10,000 vessels so that we would know, 2,000 years later, whose hands made them. We have met the senator who wept over a destroyed city and quoted Homer and understood, in that moment, what impermanence actually meant. What do we take from all of this? Not a lesson, exactly. History resists the reduction to simple lessons, and anyone who tells you Rome fell because of this one thing, or that Rome's success proves this single principle, is selling something simpler than the truth. The Romans themselves spent centuries arguing about why things happened the way they did, and they had the advantage of being there, and they still couldn't agree. But if not a lesson, then perhaps a quality of attention. The Romans were a civilization that paid attention, obsessive, systematic, sometimes brutal, occasionally magnificent attention to the physical world they inhabited. They measured it, mapped it, built across it, administered it, argued about it in courts and assemblies, wrote about it in histories and poems and agricultural manuals, and in 100,000 inscriptions on stone that were intended to outlast the people who commissioned them. And they did outlast them. They outlasted the Western Empire. They outlasted the medieval period. They outlasted the Renaissance. They are still being read by lamplight on winter nights, 2,000 years after the hands that carved them turned to dust. There is a detail in Pliny the Younger's letters about the eruption of Vesuvius that I have been saving for this moment. After everything, after watching the mountain erupt, after seeing the ash cloud rise and collapse, after the terrifying darkness and the earth tremors and the sea pulling back from its bed in the anomalous withdrawal that precedes a tsunami, after all of this, Pliny the Younger records that his uncle, the elder Pliny, who was sailing toward the disaster rather than away from it, asked for a bath and a meal when he reached his friend's house at Stabiae. He bathed, he ate, he went to sleep. He slept so deeply that the household could hear him snoring through the door. He died on the beach the next morning, almost certainly from the volcanic gases. But he had his bath and his meal and his sleep first. I find this detail more illuminating than almost anything else in the account. Not because it is heroic, it is, in fact, the most Roman possible response to catastrophe, which is to impose the daily routine on the chaos as a way of refusing to be overwhelmed by it. Bathe, eat, sleep. The mountain can wait. The bath is also Roman engineering. Of course, the hypocaust floor, the heated water, the strigil and oil, all of it, the infrastructure of civilization pressed into service against the end of the world, at least as the end of the world was presenting itself that particular evening on the Bay of Naples. The mountain is always waiting. The empire is always finite. The institutions will not hold forever. The roads will eventually crumble, and the aqueducts will eventually fail, and the legal code will eventually transform into something its authors would not recognize, and the language will drift into new languages. and the names on the stones will erode until they are unreadable, and the bread in the oven will carbonize, and the gold bracelet will be found in the ash by people who do not know her name. And yet, the bath, the meal, the sleep. The Romans built things to last, and some of them lasted. The Romans built ideas to last, and some of those lasted even longer. The Romans loved their children, tended their household shrines, complained about the noise of the street traffic, argued about politics at dinner, wrote letters home from distant walls, stamped their names into clay pots so that someone would know who made them, and in the end, inevitably as Vesuvius, as inevitably as the barbarian at the gate, as inevitably as the slow thinning of institutions that have stretched past their capacity, in the end, they returned to the earth from which the city on the Palatine Hill had first taken its improbable form. And yet, the columns still stood, and they still stand. Tonight we set down the long history of Rome, 12 centuries of human achievement and human failure, of extraordinary engineering and extraordinary cruelty, of legal genius and political murder, of the baker and the emperor and the soldier on the wall, and the woman whose name we will never know who put on her gold bracelet. On the last morning of her ordinary life, they lived, they mattered. They built something that the world used for 2,000 years and has not finished using. The fact that we are here tonight, that there are people willing to spend hours in the quiet company of this history, letting it settle and breathe and take its proper time, is itself a small act of remembrance, an acknowledgement that the past is not finished with us, or we with it. Marcus Aurelius wrote by lamplight in a military tent on the Danube 2,000 years ago, "Do not indulge in fantasies about the life you might have lived. Look instead at the life you have, and live it as well as you can, and be grateful that you have it to live at all." He was writing to himself, remember? He was not issuing imperial commands. He was a tired man in a cold tent on a difficult frontier, trying to remind himself of what mattered, the way tired people in difficult situations have always tried to remind themselves of what matters. The fact that his reminder survived was copied in the monasteries, printed in the Renaissance, translated into 100 languages, is still in print today, is not something he intended. He intended to sleep after writing it, which he presumably did, and to go back to the campaign in the morning, which he also presumably did. That the words outlasted him, as words sometimes do, as the columns sometimes do, as the idea of the aqueduct and the republic and the public library outlasted the civilization that built them. That is simply what happens sometimes when a person does their best work in an honest attempt to understand their own brief time. The Tiber still flows. The Pantheon still stands. The oculus is still open. The drain at the center of the floor still works. Somewhere in northern England, in the museums along Hadrian's Wall, there is a small wooden tablet. On it, in 2nd century handwriting that is still completely legible to anyone who knows Latin, Claudia Severa has added a few words in her own hand to the letter her scribe wrote for her. She is inviting her friend to her birthday party. She calls her her dearest soul. She says she hopes very much that she will come. She means it. You can tell even now, across 19 centuries, that she means it. Rest now. You have been good company on a very long journey. The Roman Empire, from the village to the cattle in the forum, from the founding myths of Romulus and the wolf to the quiet medieval monks copying the law books in cold scriptoria, is behind us now. It is understood, or as close to understood, as a civilization of that scale and complexity ever gets, in the space of a night and a few hours of careful attention. The roads are still there, under the motorways. The law is still there, in the legal codes. The language is still there, in the words you use today without thinking about where they came from. The water is still flowing, in the tradition of the aqueduct, through the pipes of every city that decided clean water was a public good. The idea of the republic, the imperfect, contested, always under pressure idea that power belongs to the citizens and must answer to the law, is still there, in every institution that takes it seriously, and in every argument about what it means and whether we are living up to it. They gave us a great deal. They also took a great deal from the enslaved, from the conquered, from the peoples whose cultures were absorbed or destroyed in the making of the empire. Both things are true. Holding both of them at once, without resolving the tension into a simple verdict, is the most honest thing we can do for the Romans and for ourselves. The hill is still there. The river still bends around it. And somewhere under the accumulated centuries of city and church and ruin and modern apartment block and tourist shop and metro line, at the base of the oldest stratigraphy, there is still the soil that the first Latin settlers turned when they decided, with no particular historical awareness of what they were beginning, to build something here rather than somewhere else. In the quiet of tonight, as you drift toward sleep, their voices are still echoing, if we take the time to listen. The baker and the bracelet, the wall and the water, the road and the law, the birthday invitation, the philosophy in the lamp, the bread in the oven, all still there, in the ways that matter, all still ours. Sleep well, and if tonight's journey stirred something in you, a memory, a story your parents told, a connection to the ancient world through your own family's history, or simply a thought about what civilizations owe each other. Across the centuries, I would be genuinely honored if you shared it in the comments below. Your generation holds perspectives on the arc of history, on the rise and fall of institutions, on what endures and what does not, that no textbook has captured and no documentary has preserved. Those perspectives belong in the record. If you are willing to share them, the space below is yours. I will see you in the next one.